and had declared its intention to depose Musharraf as soon as the PPP and PMLN came to power. It did not do so. Failing to get PPP support on this important issue, Sharif and the PMLN withdrew from the coalition on August 25, 2008. With pressure mounting from the United States to do something about the use of Pakistani territory as a base of operations for al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and with the Pakistani government itself deeply divided on how to move forward, the country was in turmoil and its future direction was extremely uncertain. The situation seemed dire not only for Musharraf, but from the American perspective as well. For all of his limitations, Musharraf was an important ally in the war on terror. He had literally put his life on the line by siding with the United States against the Taliban government in Afghanistan after 9/11. By 2007, however, his support seemed to waver. He turned greater authority over the pursuit of militants to local tribal officials along the Afghan-Pakistani border, reducing the role of the Pakistani army. From the American perspective, this hurt the prospects for continued success against the terrorists. Musharraf argued that it would prove beneficial because the locals knew the situation on the ground infinitely better than any outsiders and they had the local clout to get things done. My own view was that this was a move by Musharraf to extract more economic and military aid from the United States by threatening to allow the situation to deteriorate if the aid was not forthcoming. It's important to note that my students knew nothing about my personal view. Although very much his own man and hardly perfect in American eyes, Musharraf was nevertheless the United States' best source of help in the effort to defeat al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The new government in parliament, in contrast, spoke openly of finding a way to negotiate with the groups identified by the United States government as terrorists. So what did my students find out? Their analysis showed that the PPP would have even greater policy influence relative to Sharif's PMLN than the PPP's advantage in National Assembly seats implied. This was not particularly surprising, but then, if a model only produces the unexpected, we should be suspicious of it. Why wasn't it surprising? To start with, Sharif did not personally compete in the February election. That left his party without strong leadership in the National Assembly. When he finally decided to run in a by-election, the courts ruled that he was not eligible because of his earlier conviction on corruption charges when he was Prime Minister. It was, in fact, his earlier corruption case that had sent him into exile in the first place. That aspect of my students' analysis merely confirmed what any Pakistan watcher already knew. Sharif was not as popular as Bhutto, and neither was his political party as popular as hers. With her assassination, the PPP gained even greater influence, riding the crest of an upsurge in sympathy for her, her political movement, and her vision for the future. What was surprising and distressing was the pattern of evolving power among the national leadership that emerged from the analysis. While capturing the conventional wisdom about the relative power of the PPP and the PMLN, they also found a solid answer to a pressing question. Many Pakistan watchers speculated on whether the new leadership in the National Assembly would make a deal with hardliners. None, as far as I know, had dared to quantify what that might mean in terms of the future distribution of political power in Pakistan and its implications for shaping policy. The predictions my students made, based on game theory logic and the data they amassed to seed the model, can be seen in the figures that follow. The first addresses Musharraf's potential to survive the election's outcome and the conditions that ultimately would lead to his ouster. At the time their study was done, I think it is safe to say, most people believed Musharraf was finished. A few speculated on whether the United States would somehow save him, but most thought he would be political history right after the February 2008 election. Not so fast, said my students' results. Figure 10.1, on the next page, tells the story of what could have been and of what was to be. If the two parties in the government, Zardari's PPP and Sharif's PMLN, had been willing to work together, then figure 10.1 shows us that Musharraf could indeed have been ousted in March or April 2008, just as the pundits expected. The government parties' combined power, the heavy solid line in figure 10.1, overtakes Musharraf in the period between March and April. That would have been the opportunity to kick him out, as expected by most Pakistan watchers. But the model tells us that the PPP and PMLN were not willing to work together at that time. The model shows that Sharif believed throughout this period that he could pressure Zardari and his party into doing just what Sharif wanted. The model also tells us that Sharif was wrong. According to the model's results, Zardari saw no reason to listen to Sharif since the PPP had substantially more clout than Sharif's PMLN as we know now. Rather than work together, Sharif threatened to withdraw his support for the government in May 2008, because Zardari was unwilling to commit to deposing Musharraf. Fig. 10.1. How long could Musharraf be tolerated? But figure 10.1 tells a more complete story than just that. We can also see that the model projected that Zardari's PPP, the dashed line in the figure, on its own, without help from Sharif, would surpass the declining Musharraf in power by June or July 2008. At that point, the PPP didn't need anyone's help to dump Musharraf. They had the clout to do it on their own. We now know that they in fact did push him out in August 2008 and that Zardari assumed Musharraf's role as Pakistan's president. So while the world's media were counting Musharraf out in February, the students successfully forecast that the divide between the PMLN and the PPP would allow Musharraf to hang on for about 6 months past when they began their study. But even this is but a small part of the big emerging story played out in advance by modeling key Pakistani policy issues. Figure 10.1 compares the power of only 3 of many players in Pakistan's political game. Let's see what the picture looks like when we throw in the main potential threats to Pakistan's civil, secular government. I have in mind Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani and Afghani Taliban, and even Pakistan's military, with its long history of coups against civilian governments. Figure 10.2 tells an incredibly distressing story for any who hold out hope for stable democracy in Pakistan. Pakistan's Taliban and their Afghan compatriots work together as one, so I present them as if they are one. Looked at this way, they are far and away the most powerful force within Pakistan. And Al-Qaeda is next in line according to the model, at least after April 2008, when their power is projected to surpass the government's. Al-Qaeda just continues to grow and grow. Together with the Taliban, they constitute the emerging dominant source of political influence in Pakistan, with only outside influencers like the United States or the Europeans being possible counterweights. Remember, we are plotting power, political influence weighted by salience, based on information known, or at least estimated by my students, back in January 2008 and not after. Yet here is the headline from the New York Times lead story on June 30, 2008. Months after the analysis was done, amid U.S. policy disputes, Qaeda grows in Pakistan. The story goes on to say, it is increasingly clear that the Bush administration will leave office with Al-Qaeda having successfully relocated its base from Afghanistan to Pakistan's tribal areas, where it has rebuilt much of its ability to attack from the region and broadcast its messages to militants across the world. My students were able to foresee this troubling prospect half a year ahead of the New York Times. Maybe they could have done so even earlier. Remember, they only assembled their data in January 2008, when the course, Solving Foreign Crises, began. They saw this result immediately. Fig. 10.2. Who will have the clout in Pakistan? There is one other troubling feature to Figure 10.2. Other parts of the model's output tell us that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban will try to negotiate an arrangement with the PPP and the PMLN. Sharif's PMLN is modestly more open to such talks than is Zardari's PPP. Both prefer to live with the existing status quo vis-a-vis the militant groups while trying to consolidate their own hold on power. In the meantime, the Pakistani military sees itself slowly but steadily losing influence. Such a circumstance raises the prospect that they will try to stem the tide against them by launching a coup to take control of the government. The optimal period for them to take such a step is projected to be between February 2009 and July 2009. Earlier than that they see no need, and later may be too late for them. Pakistan's fragile democracy appears likely to be under assault from the militants who would establish a non-democratic fundamentalist regime on one side, and from the army that would establish a military government on the other. What does this mean about Pakistan's contribution to the war on terror? Will they make a more vigorous effort to pursue militants and stamp them out, or will the Pakistani government succumb to the projected growing influence of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? I think you can guess the answer. But just in case you can't, Figure 10.3 tells that story. The status quo commitment to go after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban back when my students began their project was at 40 on their issue scale. A value of 40 meant some real efforts to contain the militants but falling well short of trying to stamp them out as the United States wanted. That was equivalent to a score of 100 on the scale. The status quo, with some erosion, was close to the policy predicted to hold, more or less, until the summer of 2008. A position of 0, Al-Qaeda's position, not shown, meant, do nothing against the militants. With that in mind, let's see what we predict for the future. Fig. 10.3. Who will urge Pakistan's pursuit of internal militant groups? The dashed line and the dotted line in Figure 10.3 show the predicted positions of Zardari's PPP and Sharif's PMLN, respectively. After June 2008, their approach is projected to be little more than rhetorical opposition to the militants with almost no serious commitment to go after them. Talk about a balloon bursting. The air just pours out of the anti-militant effort. That puts responsibility for going after the militants squarely in the United States' corner. Throughout the remainder of his term, President Bush is adamant, but ineffective, in his commitment to persuade the Pakistani government to go after the hardliners. After the summer of 2008, even he pretty much gives up on this strategy. Instead, my students found that the U.S. approach will shift ground. The United States' two-pronged strategy of clandestine American pursuit and open Pakistani pursuit of militants will be replaced by a much greater emphasis on the, perhaps clandestine, use of the American military directly within Pakistan. Even that commitment, the student projections indicate, will collapse shortly after the American presidential election. The new president is not likely to do much of anything about the rise of terrorist influence within Pakistan at least through the end of 2009, when the student projection ends. It seems that after a new president is inaugurated, of course, we now know that the president is Barack Obama. But back in the spring of 2008, neither my students nor the model made assumptions about the American election. The war on terror will not be effectively focused within Pakistan. We just had a brief sketch of the major findings regarding Pakistan. There is much more detail that could be discussed about how and why these results arise, but the more interesting question is, what is to be done? Recall that my students also studied U.S. foreign aid to Pakistan and its likely impact on Pakistani policy. They estimated the current level of U.S. economic assistance to Pakistan in fiscal 2008 as $700 million. That was an approximation, but probably a reasonable one. The true amount is surely a mix of public and secret information. They then looked at how congressional and presidential support for that number would change over time, taking into account domestic pressures and the pressures within Pakistan. Here is what they found. The analysis shows that substantial domestic political pressure is likely to push for cuts in American aid to Pakistan. President Bush and the Democratic Congress are predicted to move apart at least through the summer of 2008. Remember, the data are from January of that year. Indeed, by early summer, the projection was that the president would be pressing for Congress to increase annual aid to Pakistan from $700 million to around $900 million to $1 billion. Did he? Bush proposed shifting an additional $230 million in counter-terrorism funds during the summer of 2008. The model predicted that Congress would hold the line on aid during that same period, and they did. Congress has complained in actuality about the amount of aid the United States is giving to Pakistan, but more on that in a moment. After the summer of 2008, the analysis reports that while the president continues to advocate greater aid than Congress supports, the two begin to converge slowly. Both conclude that aid just isn't buying the policy compliance the U.S. government wants. Put bluntly, American foreign aid is supposed to pay the Pakistani government to go after the militants. It is failing. Indeed, by June 2008, the public discussion coming out of Congress alleged that Pakistan was misusing U.S. aid funds. Money was being spent on items like air defense with Bush's support, even though al-Qaeda and its allies in Pakistan are not known to have any air capability. Air defense might be helpful for Pakistan against a threat from, say, India. So, while administration officials countered that the impact of aid on Pakistan's anti-terrorist efforts was being underestimated, Congress made the case that the money was being thrown down a rat hole. It is not hard to see that, as projected by my students' analysis, President Obama will face real pressure to support less aid for Pakistan. My students worked through the implications of their assessment and they despaired. Their analysis convinced them that al-Qaeda and the Taliban were getting stronger and that U.S. reluctance to increase aid was more likely to reinforce that trend than reverse it. It was clear from their investigation that the United States cared deeply about getting Pakistan's help in tracking down and neutralizing militants and terrorists operating within Pakistan's borders. It was equally clear that Pakistan's government leaders, the PPP, Sharif and his PMLN, and Musharraf's backers in the military, wanted much more U.S. aid than they were receiving. They could see that the then current U.S. policy did not provide either a sufficient carrot or a painful enough stick to convince Pakistani leaders to put themselves at risk by going after the militants. With these observations in hand, my students began to think about how they might go beyond predicting developments to trying to shape them, or at least simulate doing so. And so they initiated a search for a strategy that might get Pakistan's leaders to make a more serious effort to rein in the militants. They looked at the possibility of trading aid dollars for policy concessions. Seeing that the Pakistanis want more money and the United States wants greater efforts to track down militants, they wondered whether an aid for pursuit deal might not improve the situation from the American and the Pakistani perspectives. Using foreign aid to secure policy compliance is a time-honored use of such funds, even if, at the assumed $700 million in economic aid, it did not seem to be working in Pakistan. Looking at their assessments, my students could see why Pakistan's leaders were not aggressively pursuing militants despite the then U.S. aid program for Pakistan. They could see that the leadership, Musharraf, the PPP, and the PMLN, expected to take too much political heat from al-Qaeda and the Taliban for it to be in their interest at the prevailing foreign aid level. And so my students set out to analyze how that might change if the United States gave significantly more aid than their analysis indicated was going to be the case. Figures 10.4a and 10.4b show the same projections through the end of President Bush's term, but then they diverge. Figure 10.4a continues to forecast the relative influence of the U.S. government and the militants in Pakistan through the end of 2009 if President Obama follows the foreign aid course pursued by the Bush administration. Figure 10.4b assumes that Obama follows the course recommended by my students, and also by his now Vice President, Joseph Biden, equal essentially to doubling U.S. aid. As is evident from the figures, continuing the current aid policy is a losing proposition. With 2008 aid levels, the United States maintains a small power advantage over the militants during Obama's first year in office. That advantage virtually disappears by the start of 2010. The picture is entirely different if the United States and Pakistan strike a deal that trades dollars for aggressive pursuit of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Rather than coming out of the chute looking to make a deal with the militants, the National Assembly leaders confront the Taliban and al-Qaeda. They impose heavy political and material costs on them and bear heavy costs in return. With the Pakistani government motivated by a doubling of aid dollars, the Obama administration increases U.S. clout in Pakistan at the direct expense of the militant groups, including al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and elements sympathetic to them within Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. According to the model's logic and evidence, we can fundamentally change the lay of the land in Pakistan, but to do so, we need to be responsive to the interests Zardari's government has in getting its hands on more money. They won't take the heat against the militants without it. No doubt some of that money will be stolen by corrupt officials, but that's the point. They will want to continue the flow of dollars, and the only way they'll succeed at that is by helping the United States against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It is evident from my students' analysis that a promise of greater efforts to go after militants will accompany an increase in U.S. aid. This, however, leaves two questions to be answered. How did we arrive at the idea that doubling aid is the optimal aid for pursuit deal, and will each side to such a deal follow through and show that they are really committed to it? My students answered the first question but didn't have enough time to analyze the second, so I will do so here. But first, how do we work out what the optimal aid package looks like? Fig. 10.4a and b reining in Pakistan's militants by doubling foreign aid. Back in Game Theory 101, I introduced a way to look at how players resolve trade-offs across issues. In that chapter we were examining the notion of the national interest and saw that there were lots of ways to put a winning electoral coalition together, some of which supported freer trade and others fairer trade, some of which endorsed increased defense spending and others reduced spending. Now, using my students' analysis, we can build on their solutions to the game and apply that methodology, known as win sets, to their simulated results to evaluate the maximum pursuit that the United States can get from the Pakistani government and the cost in aid dollars to get that maximum pursuit. Figure 10.5 plots the preferred policies on aid and pursuit of militants held by Pakistan's leadership and the average of the preferred foreign aid package supported by Congress and the President, and their shared view on pursuit of militants, around July 2008 against the predicted status quo on these two dimensions at that time. July 2008, roughly when Musharraf was predicted to be deposed and a new, PPP-dominated regime was expected to take over, is chosen as a prominent early opportunity to strike a deal that trades aid dollars for pursuit of the militants. The solid gray petal-shaped area in the figure shows the range of aid packages and levels of pursuit that are improvements over the status quo from the U.S. government's and the Pakistani government's perspectives. Different points within this gray area show different mutually acceptable trades between aid money and efforts to take down the militants. The optimal deal is in the top right corner of the petal. At that point the United States extracts the maximum effort by Pakistan's leaders against the militants, and the Pakistanis in turn extract the maximum amount of money they can get. More money buys no additional commitment to go after the militants, and greater effort against the militants extracts no additional dollars. That is true because policies outside the petal are not mutually beneficial relative to the status quo, since policies outside the petal are farther from what one or the other set of players wants relative to the fallback position that is the status quo. So what is the optimal deal? The horizontal arrow in Figure 10.5 shows the amount of foreign aid that secures the greatest effort to pursue militants by Pakistan's leaders. That amount is $1.50 billion for 2009. The vertical arrow identifies the maximum effort in pursuing militants that secures $1.50 billion in U.S. aid. That level of pursuit is equivalent to about 80 on the pursuit scale. That is, my students found that for $1.50 billion in aid it is very likely that Pakistan's National Assembly, its president, and other important players would really go after the terrorist threat emanating from their country. That is a bit more than double the aid estimated for 2008 and many times the amount advocated by the president or Congress at the outset of the new president's term, according to the model-based analysis. It requires a marked change in U.S. policy. Fig. 10.5. Aid dollars can buy great pursuit of militants. What would it buy? Put in terms of the issue scale, if the Pakistani leaders get $1.50 billion in U.S. aid, their pursuit of militants will be far above the status quo score of 40 as of January 2008, but it will not equal the intense pursuit identified with a score of 100. That was the level the Bush administration and Congress wanted and surely is the level any American president will desire. So we won't get 100, but we certainly will get a lot more than what is projected without this infusion of money. But please don't get me, my students, or the analysis wrong. The Pakistani government is unlikely to completely quash the terrorist threat just for money. They are no fools. They know that the money will dry up if al-Qaeda and the Taliban are destroyed. So for money they will rein the threat in and reduce it, that's 80 on the scale, but not utterly destroy it, that would be 100 on the scale. For their own political survival they will do whatever it takes. They will try to wipe out the militants if that is their best political path, but if making a deal with the hardliners looks politically best for Pakistan's leaders, then that is what they will do. $1.5 billion would go a long way to convincing them that they are better off going after the militants, insurgents, and terrorists than accommodating them. Of course, if an aid for pursuit deal is struck, each side will have to feel confident that the other side will not renege. Pakistan's leaders must believe that aid dollars will continue to flow, and Congress must believe that, having received the money, Pakistan's leaders will not turn around and still make a deal with the militants. The latter may be of especially great concern because even with an aid deal, al-Qaeda's clout, although diminished, still continues to be substantial, as projected in Figure 10.4b. What the model shows is that the leadership in the National Assembly will sustain pursuit of militants at around 75 to 80 on the scale, round after round after round. With the aid deal buying so much greater an effort to combat terrorists within Pakistan, Congress and the President are expected to remain steadfast in their commitment to the proposed aid agreement. All parties to the deal show a real commitment to sustain it, each for their own political benefit. Without the huge infusion of aid funds from the United States, I'm afraid the projected future is that Pakistan's leaders will make a deal with the militants, who will become a legitimate part of policy making in Pakistan, or that country's government will face another military coup. In all likelihood, American interests will decline and be thwarted. Too bad that this is what's likely to happen. $1.5 billion is a cheap price to pay to stabilize a civil, secular Pakistani government. Iran and Iraq. Is there a marriage made in heaven? The future my students projected for Pakistan back in 2008 was grim. The reality a year later is at least as grim. Looking back over their predictions, some about things that have now happened and others about events yet to come, it seems that their play of the predictioneer's game has proven depressingly accurate. Sometimes it really would be better to get things wrong. Now, in the spring of 2009, we have another chance to test the game. Let's grab that chance and see where it takes us. Just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Pakistan and all its troubles, Iran and Iraq are facing an uncertain future. That uncertainty provides a golden opportunity to dare again to be embarrassed. You see, as I write this in early April 2009, I am again teaching the course on solving foreign crises that was used in 2008 to predict Pakistan's stability, or, more precisely, its instability. Two excellent students in my 2009 course have put my model to good use, looking into the future relations between Iran and Iraq. In doing so, they have uncovered some pretty important insights about likely political developments in each of those countries. Their starting point, will Iran and Iraq forge a strategic partnership, illuminates a debate at the heart of two entirely different perspectives on American foreign policy. Should the U.S. government keep troops in Iraq, as President Obama proposes to do, or should we pull out altogether? The predictioneer's game can help answer that question. Let's review a few critical facts before plunging into the analysis. Back before the November 2008 presidential election, candidate Barack Obama promised to withdraw American troops from Iraq within 16 months. On February 27, 2009, ensconced in the White House, Obama stretched his pre-election withdrawal timetable a little bit, to August 2010. That did not seem to have elicited any great controversy either among pro-war Republicans or anti-war Democrats. But when he announced the timing of the U.S. withdrawal, he also declared his intention to keep 50,000 American troops in Iraq. That's no small, token force. It is, in fact, 36% of the total number of U.S. soldiers in Iraq at the time he announced his policy. Not too surprisingly, he was subjected to plenty of complaints within the ranks of the Democratic Party for moving too slowly on pulling U.S. forces out of Iraq altogether. Predictably, he also got scant praise in return from the Republicans. Politics is not a warm and cuddly business. Obama took additional heat because these combat-ready troops are slated to stay in Iraq at least until 2011, when a pre-existing agreement with the Iraqi government calls for a full withdrawal. Of course, the possibility remains that the 2011 deadline could be extended indefinitely. The decision President Obama made in February 2009 and the reality he will face in August 2010 may look alike, and they may not. Pressure within his own party and changing circumstances on the ground might result in a decision to keep far fewer troops in Iraq. But of course it is also possible that President Obama will stick to his guns, 50,000 of them. I am not going to try to resolve here which he will do, but I am going to use the predictioneer's game to resolve which he ought to do. The answer will not depend on my personal inclinations or those of my students. I certainly don't know what they favor. I had barely given this question any thought myself before doing the analysis. Of course, this investigation touches on only a few aspects of the policy implications of keeping U.S. forces in Iraq or withdrawing them. Facets of American security not examined here may also be influenced by the U.S. decision to pull out of or stay in Iraq. For instance, the troop decision also might make a difference in which way Iran heads in its pursuit of a nuclear capability. But I do not tackle that issue here. I will just say that the prospects of resolving that country's nuclear threat are sufficiently good, based on earlier analyses I have done on Iran, that I do not believe a continued, greatly reduced American military presence will materially tip the resolution of the nuclear issue one way or the other. 1. Why might Iran and Iraq want to be partners? Pulling American troops out of Iraq is predicated on the idea that by the summer of 2010 Iraq will be able to defend itself against internal and external threats to its security. The Iraqi leadership must, of course, be mindful of the giant white elephant on its border as well as the potential of resurgent insurgents at home. One way to cope with its giant neighbor, Iran, is to forge close ties between the two countries. With that possibility in mind, let's think about the range of deals Iran's Shiite theocracy might strike with Iraq's secular but Shiite-dominated government. As we contemplate a possible Iraqi-Iranian partnership, we must keep in mind that relations between Sunni and Shia Muslims are often extremely fractious, and more so in countries like Iraq, where both groups make up a substantial segment of the population. Iraq's population is divided roughly 65% to 35% between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and many followers of the two factions hate one another. That divide certainly was a major factor that gave rise to Iraq's insurgencies and the U.S. creation of those CLCs we talked about in Game Theory 101. During the insurgency, many Shia residents in Sunni areas were driven from their homes, and sometimes murdered on sight, by local Sunni militias. Likewise, Sunni residents in Shia-dominated communities were driven out or murdered. Although things are calmer now and some people have returned to their homes, many have not, and animosities linger just beneath the surface, ever ready to explode at the first sign of provocation. Unlike Iraq, Iran does not have much of a domestic Shia-Sunni problem. That's not so surprising. After all, Sunni Muslims are in scarce supply in Iran. There are about 10 Shia for every 1 Sunni in that country. That is, however, not to suggest that Iranians are warmly disposed or even indifferent to the Sunni branch of Islam. Iran has certainly had more than its share of contentious relations with Sunni-dominated governments in the Middle East and in the wider Islamic world. Most notably, Iran had terrible relations with Iraq during the long years in which the latter was run by Saddam Hussein. Iran and Iraq fought an 8-year war that killed more than 1 million people and saw the extensive use of chemical warfare. Few in Iraq or Iran have forgotten, and fewer still are likely to forgive, so building bridges between these two countries will not be an easy matter. Staying apart, however, carries its own considerable share of risks. The Shia-dominated Iraqi government headed by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki sees Iran as a potentially sympathetic and like-minded ally. In contrast, he and his closest Iraqi followers may consider their own Sunni brethren a threat to their regime and their vision for Iraq's future. Maliki surely wants to shore up Iraq's security and, according to the data my students assembled, he sees forming a strategic alliance with Iran as the way to do so once the US reduces its military presence or pulls out altogether. His starting position on the partnering issue described in the table on the next page is at 80. That means getting Iran to guarantee Iraq's security. Such an assurance would provide a credible military threat from Iran against any anti-Shia rebellion in Iraq. That could be just the insurance the Maliki government needs. The Iran-Iraq partners game. Position. Meaning. Detailed implications for Iran-Iraq relations. 100. Full strategic partnership. Free flow of arms and military technology. A mutual defense alliance. Joint intelligence operations. 80. Concentrated partnership. Restricted flow of arms and technology. Some intelligence sharing. An alliance in which each guarantees to defend the other. 50. Restrictive partnership. Limited arms flow. No technology transfer. No shared intelligence. Each promises not to use force against the other. 20. Minimal partnership. Considerable restrictions on arms flow. No signed alliance agreement at all. 0. No strategic partnership. No flow of arms or technology. The two governments reaffirm their commitment to the Algiers Accord. 2. Putting such a partnership together, however, will not be easy. Besides the usual complexities behind any international negotiation, it is likely that the US government will present stiff diplomatic opposition to such a move by Iraq. Besides pressure from Obama, we can be confident that those who represent Iraq's Sunni interests will also strenuously oppose any deal with Iran. As for Iran, a deal with Iraq would advance Iran's ambition to become the dominant regional power, but the Iranian government will have to ponder the risks of associating closely with a regime that could fall into Sunni hands. The partnership issue seems especially well suited to evaluating whether the United States is better off keeping some troops in Iraq or removing all of them. Iran, after all, is hardly the state Obama would like to see exercise real influence over Iraqi policy, and a partnership between the two countries could have exactly that consequence. The table tells us there's quite a range of possible future relations between Iran and Iraq, and of course we need to play the game to work out what is likely to happen. From Barack Obama's vantage point, Iraq ought not to be too quick to jump into bed with Iran. He thinks a policy around 0 on the scale is just right. That is, the Obama administration wants the two countries to go their separate ways while maintaining quiet at the borders, as is their obligation under the terms of their 1975 treaty. But that is not what Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki wants. He advocates a concentrated strategic partnership, 80 on the scale. Maliki's government needs a protector. If it won't be the United States, he would be content to obtain security guarantees from Iran. For him, forging a close association with his much larger neighbor makes a lot of sense. Left to his own devices, Maliki would choose a path that is opposite to the one President Obama wants. Of course, neither Maliki nor any future Iraqi leader will be left to his own devices. There's plenty of pulls and tugs on all sides, so we really do need a tool, like game theory, to help us sort out what the future holds. While President Obama urges Prime Minister Maliki not to make a deal with Iran, the expert data going into the game indicates that Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader with a veto over all Iranian policy, welcomes an opportunity for an even closer relationship than Maliki desires. He, too, wants a mutual defense agreement, but he also wants an almost unrestricted flow of intelligence and arms dealing between his government and Iraq's. It appears that Khamenei would like to use Iraq as a base for gathering information about the goings-on in the Arab states next door and beyond. So there is a substantial difference between Obama's vision for Iran and Iraq and the ambitions of the leaders of those two countries. What will Iraq offer to Iran? With this bit of background in mind, we can ask what is likely to happen under two plausible scenarios. 1. Iran and Iraq first work out their respective positions through the normal internal give and take of domestic politics and then, having resolved the stance they will take, negotiate against the backdrop of ongoing U.S. pressure in the form of a continuing 50,000-strong American military presence in Iraq. Or, 2. They each settle their domestic games and then negotiate their future relations bilaterally, without outside interference and with American forces fully withdrawn. Figure 10.6a displays the evolving positions of four key political figures in Iraq: Prime Minister Maliki, Vice President and leading Sunni politician Tariq al-Hashimi, Iraq's President Jalal Talabani, who leads Iraq's Kurdish faction, and Muqtada al-Sadr, the militant anti-American Shiite leader. The analysis on which the figure is based assumes that the United States will fully withdraw its troops by August 2010, an outcome favored not only by many Americans but also by many Iraqis. Figure 10.6b displays the same key Iraqi political leaders, but this time having solved the game under the assumption that the United States will maintain 50,000 combat-ready forces in Iraq. The analyses are not precise about when Iraq's leaders will come to a stable point of view on dealing with Iran, but they do imply that a decision will be reached not much later than August 2010, and quite possibly earlier. The issue appears to be on the back burner for now, but it will surely heat up as the U.S. withdrawal date draws nearer. The model shows that it takes 6 or 7 bargaining rounds before Iraq's political interests, including many more than the 4 leaders displayed in the figures, come to an agreement on how to deal with Iran. That is a large number of rounds before a stable outcome can emerge. So many rounds of internal discussion imply a long stretch of time between when the issue moves to the front burner and when it is settled internally. Apparently it will not be easy for the Iraqis to work out what they want their future relationship with Iran to look like. Fig. 10.6a. The likely Iraqi approach to Iran if the United States pulls out. Figures 10.6a and 10.6b, viewed together, tell an interesting story. Despite their deep differences, Maliki, Talabani, and Hashimi slowly but surely come around to a collective agreement. They will support a relatively lukewarm relationship with Iran, a relationship not nearly as close as Maliki wants. According to the game, Iraqi diplomats will be authorized to seek an agreement with Iran that includes limited arms flow between the two countries, with no preparedness to transfer technology or share intelligence. In terms of a formal treaty relationship, what is likely to be sought is a promise from each not to use force against the other. That means, in the parlance of international affairs, that Iraq seeks a mutual non-aggression pact. The United States ultimately will support this undertaking, but only after a protracted negotiation. If U.S. troops remain in Iraq, Talabani will feel emboldened to press for an even weaker association with Iran, but he will not prevail. He will go along with Maliki's compromise position if U.S. troops are withdrawn. Fig. 10.6b. The likely Iraqi approach to Iran if the United States keeps 50,000 troops in Iraq. There is one more element in figures 10.6a and b that is strikingly important. Muqtada al-Sadr, the militant Shia cleric, steadfastly opposes the pursuit of a watered-down, weak partnership with Iran. In the absence of a U.S. military presence, he does not budge from his initial point of view. That perspective favors almost the most extreme partnership anyone advocates. Indeed, as we will see, only some Iranian leaders, like Ahmadinejad, want as much. Sadr advocates a free flow of arms and military technology between the two countries, accompanied by a mutual defense alliance and joint intelligence operations. He will back ever so slightly away from that extreme position if the United States retains troops in Iraq, presumably out of concern for the security of his own operations. Iraq's political winners and losers. Before leaving the internal decision-making in Iraq for a look at the comparable domestic evaluation of choices in Iran, we would do well to inquire about who will be Iraq's political winners and losers on this big question of partnership with Iran. Figure 10.7a displays the predicted changes in political influence for Maliki, Hashimi, Sadr, and Talabani if the United States fully withdraws. Figure 10.7b evaluates the same power question if Obama leaves 50,000 combat troops in Iraq. Fig. 10.7a. Changing power in Iraq if the United States withdraws completely. Even a cursory glance at the projected changes in political power in Iraq suggests that Prime Minister Maliki will need a deal with Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei more urgently if the United States pulls out than if Obama proves true to his word and keeps American soldiers in Iraq. Figure 10.7a indicates that after months of rising political clout, Maliki's influence will start to decline around late spring or early summer 2011. Meanwhile, Hashimi's power will rise steadily. Without a substantial U.S. troop presence, the game indicates that sometime around early to mid-2012 Hashimi will be almost dead even with Maliki in clout. Conversely, if the United States retains a large contingent of combat-ready troops, while Hashimi's growth in power is unabated, Maliki's power does not go into decline. He remains considerably more powerful than his Sunni political rival. Since Maliki has shown himself willing to cooperate with the U.S. government and Hashimi mostly has not, a continued troop presence may be important to prevent Hashimi from becoming a bigger player than he already is. Maliki may want to reconsider the 2011 deadline for a complete U.S. troop withdrawal. Fig. 10.7b. Changing power in Iraq if the United States keeps 50,000 combat troops there. With 50,000 American soldiers in Iraq, Sadr's political future looks much worse than if the United States withdraws. To be sure, The assessment derived from the game indicates that Sadr is entering a period of decline either way, but his downfall is steeper if President Obama resists the pressure to withdraw. President Talabani is also on the way down either way, but he falls faster and farther if the United States pulls out. That is a rather unfortunate combination of circumstances because Sadr is openly hostile to the United States and Talabani views the United States as an important ally. The really big story in Iraq, however, takes us back to the changing fortunes of Hashemi and Maliki, especially if the United States pulls all of its forces out of Iraq. As I mentioned, Maliki is a reasonably reliable friend. He understands the brazen pursuit of his self-interest. He will just as quickly make a deal with Iran if the United States pulls out as he will make nice to the United States if American troops remain in place. He's got his finger in the wind and he is working out who will do the most to be his guardian angel. The big risk in his political life is being ousted from office. The major domestic threat to his continued hold on power clearly comes from Hashemi. Hashemi wants Iraq to have nothing to do with Iran. Furthermore, he wants to reverse the government's policy of de-Baathification. That is, he wants an end to the ongoing exclusion of former Baathists, Saddam Hussein's party, from the government. And Hashemi staunchly opposes a federal structure for Iraq. Federalism is seen by many, most notably Vice President Joseph Biden, as the most promising means to avert civil war. Thus a political struggle along the Shia-Sunni, Maliki-Hashemi divide is likely to cast a huge shadow over Iraq if U.S. forces are withdrawn. It is a much smaller shadow with U.S. forces on the scene. With Maliki's power slipping while Hashemi's rises under the withdrawal scenario, there seem to be only two ways things can go, and neither is good from the U.S. perspective. Maliki can enter into a power-sharing arrangement with Hashemi. That would significantly strengthen the central government and assuage many Sunnis, two good things, but it might also open the door for the Baathists to regain control, a potentially very bad outcome indeed. After all, the projected power in the absence of the United States shows Maliki and Hashemi almost dead even and with Maliki on a downward spiral while Hashemi is ascending. Maliki, fearful of just such a takeover by Baathists, might opt for the second solution to the threat to his power. Rather than sharing leadership with Hashemi, he might call on Iran to step in and help defend his regime against a nascent Sunni-led insurgency or civil war. That, of course, would be an awful outcome for just about everyone except the Iranian leadership. Iran-Iraq partnership. The feasibility of Iran's army being invited in to help shore up Maliki's regime against a Sunni threat depends, of course, on the nature of the deal the two countries will strike. The internal dynamics in Iran lead quickly, after just 3 rounds of domestic give and take, to a decision on how Khamenei should deal with Iraq in trying to forge a partnership. He will seek a full strategic partnership. Once each country has resolved its own views on partnership, it will be time for the respective negotiators to come together to discover whether they can find common ground for a deal. Figures 10.8a and b show what is likely to emerge from bilateral Iran-Iraq negotiations if the United States has pulled out militarily or keeps 50,000 troops on the ground. The pictures tell radically different stories. Without U.S. troops present, Maliki and Khamenei quickly come to terms. If American forces are on the scene, it looks like the negotiations will be abandoned, or at least tabled, well before an agreement is reached. Indeed, the game suggests that the two governments will not have come to terms with each other even after more than 2 years of negotiations, if and only if Obama maintains a 50,000-strong combat contingent in Iraq. Fig. 10.8a. Iran-Iraq negotiations after the United States withdraws. Fig. 10.8b. Iran-Iraq negotiations if the United States does not withdraw. Figures 10.8a and b depict the policy positions of the two principal decision-makers, Khamenei and Maliki, during the course of bilateral negotiations, but the figures also show the evolving policy stances of the most extreme elements with real clout in each country. Thus we see the near-polar opposite positions of Iran's President Ahmadinejad and the Banyads, a group of Iranian tax-exempt charities that exert massive control over much of Iran's economy and have enormous influence over Khamenei and the ruling council of Ayatollahs. Khamenei appears comfortable with showing real flexibility to advance the prospects of striking a deal with Maliki's government whether U.S. troops stay or go. But Mahmoud Ahmadinejad resists the partnership agreements that could be in the cards regardless of whether the United States withdraws. According to the Predictioneer's game, Ahmadinejad starts out and ends up advocating much firmer Iranian influence over Iraq than the Iraqis can agree to, and in doing so he is likely to alienate Khamenei. 3. Indeed, as we will see, Ahmadinejad doesn't get his way and this gradually costs him political influence. Meanwhile, the Banyads, that is, the principal moneyed interests in Iran, remain equally steadfast in their opposition to what could be a very costly Iranian partnership with Iraq. They hold out for about as weak a set of ties as the United States is willing to live with. They advocate a bit more than cordial relations between the two countries, but not much more than that. Who knows, as the Ayatollah's influence declines, and as we will see, it is already doing so, the Banyads may become a vehicle through which the United States can find common ground with important stakeholders in Iran. On the Iraqi side, Muqtada al-Sadr plays much the same part that Ahmadinejad plays in Iran. Sadr too proves all but immovable. However, even as he and Ahmadinejad try to scuttle an agreement, The game indicates that if the United States withdraws, Maliki and Khamenei will swiftly arrive at an agreement. The deal they are predicted to strike if Obama withdraws all American combat-ready troops is at 60 on the issue scale. This means the two countries will engage in a fair amount of arms transfers. They will capitalize on some coordination between their intelligence services, and they probably will sign an alliance, such as a mutual entente, that assures more than non-aggression between them but that does not go so far as to provide guarantees of mutual defense. Such an arrangement probably would be sufficient for Maliki to call on Iran to defend his government against a Sunni uprising if one were to occur, thereby improving the odds of keeping Hashemi at bay. If, however, the United States keeps 50,000 troops in Iraq, the picture is entirely different. As can be seen in Figure 10.8b, although negotiations can result in Khamenei and Maliki coming to terms, the conditions for a stable outcome are not present. That is undoubtedly because Maliki will face great political pressure at home. That pressure will oppose his signing a partnership agreement with Iran. So, facing such stiff domestic political pressure, Maliki will put any possible deal on hold. Even after simulating more than 2 years of negotiations, the model does not arrive at an equilibrium outcome. The game goes on. According to the game, the discussions would most probably be broken off well before the two sides could discover a deal the Iraqis could sell politically at home. That is, the American military presence is sufficient to hold Maliki's feet to the fire, keeping him from making big concessions to Khamenei. There are ways to overcome the problems Maliki will face, but considering that there is a reasonable chance that Iraqi or Iranian diplomats might read this, I leave it to them to work out how to solve their problem. It isn't likely that they would listen to what I have to say, but why test those waters? Before closing this opportunity to be embarrassed, let's take a look at the predicted evolution of political influence in Iran. This reveals some interesting insights that may make us more hopeful for the future, especially if the United States keeps forces in Iraq long enough to buy time for the predicted developments in Iran to take hold. Figure 10.9 shows the projected changes in political power among 4 key Iranian interests. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the most powerful figure in Iran, is, according to projections from the Predictioneers game, entering a long period of political decline, probably to culminate in his retirement. This signals a major change in Iranian affairs because he has a veto over virtually all policy decisions. Less well known in the West are Major General Muhammad Ali Jafari and Ayatollah Ahmad Jannati. Ayatollah Jannati is chairman of the Guardian Council. An anti-reform cleric, he can veto candidates for parliament, and he has the authority to assess whether parliamentary decisions are consistent with the constitution and with Sharia, that is, Islamic, law. As such, he is nearly as powerful a figure as Ayatollah Khamenei. Major General Jafari commands the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the elite military unit whose support sustains the regime. Each of these individuals is far more powerful than Iran's president and American nemesis, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Figure 10.9 also shows the evolving power of Iran's Banyads. The Banyads were originally created during the era of the Shah and then were completely recast after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. As I have noted, they control vast sums of money, are exempt from taxes, and answer to no one except Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. They control Iran's purse strings and, not surprisingly, have a reputation for corruption and mismanagement. But they are also political pragmatists, as we have seen, so they may be people with whom the Obama administration can find a path through to resolve many of the tensions between the United States and Iran. Fig. 10.9. Evolving power in Iran. Some hope for the future. Figure 10.9, if correct, tells a startling story of emerging change in Iran. 4. Key religious leaders like Khamenei and Jannati are in political decline. Other clerics, especially the less politically involved Qum clerics, sometimes known as the Quietists, may be picking up some of the lost power, but the lion's share of shifting political influence falls into the hands of Major General Jafari, as the principal representative of Iran's elite military units, and the Banyads, Iran's money managers. Business interests are also gaining in influence. That is, a more secular and pragmatic, albeit militarized and corruption-laden regime appears to be emerging as Iran's theocracy goes into political, if not spiritual, decline. While the theocracy is likely to hold on to the symbolic trappings of power, real control is slipping away from them and toward a more conventional strongman, money dictatorship. The analysis certainly suggests different worlds depending on whether American troops are in Iraq beyond August 2010. If Iran can strike a significant partnership arrangement with Iraq, as is likely if the United States withdraws, Iran will be well on its way to asserting itself as the dominant power in the region and will position Iran to resume its aggressive efforts to export its form of fundamentalist Islam. Such a triumph might even reverse the Ayatollah's slide toward lost political control. Fortunately, these developments are unlikely because President Obama is likely to be a man who sticks to his word. Keeping U.S. forces in Iraq appears to be sufficient to deter the strong ties between Iran and Iraq that would provide a basis for Iranian military intervention to defend the Maliki government against a potential Sunni uprising. And it also appears to be sufficient to keep Maliki strong enough that Hashemi is likely to think twice before attempting to push him aside. With a continued U.S. military presence, time can be bought to provide the opportunity for a less anti-U.S. regime to take control in Iran, a trend that emerges in the game under such conditions. Staying creates the chance to deal with a normal, petty dictatorship and maybe, just maybe, even a nascent more democratic regime. Withdrawal raises the prospects of helping the Ayatollahs stay in power while also jeopardizing the prospects of a pro-US Iraq in the future. With our analysis in hand, we can cast the debate over whether to leave the troops in place or pull everyone out by August 2010 in a clearer light. Pulling out is tantamount to inviting Iran to step in to fill the void. That would be extremely dangerous from the American perspective. On the flip side, however, we should also ask to what extent a continued U.S. presence is likely to stymie efforts by President Obama and his Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton, to negotiate a resolution of Iran's growing nuclear threat. The risk, based on other assessments I have done, seems small. What is more, if the quietist Ayatollahs are on the rise, as seems true from the game, and if the Banyads and the military are also on the rise, then Iran is soon to enter a more pragmatic era that will help foster resolution of issues, like the nuclear one, that looms so large now. Time will tell. I invite others studying these problems from different perspectives to dare also to be embarrassed and tell us now what they think will happen 2 years into the future. 11. The Big Sweep. The History of Worms. Or Bali High, Bali Low. Perhaps a good place for us to close is with an example that looks way back in time and one that projects way forward in time. First, I'll evaluate a problem that is almost 900 years old, using only information possessed by the relevant decision-makers at the time, popes and kings, to illustrate how game theory can capture and predict tectonic shifts that alter society over the course of hundreds of years, in this case the period between 1122 and 1648. Then we'll take a look at ourselves 100 to 200 years from now. But first, let's go back to 1122 and see how we could have predicted then the essential end of the Catholic Church 526 years later. The Catholic Church is not what it used to be. In the good old days, especially before 1648, the Catholic Church was to European politics what the United States is today. The hegemonic power, the big cheese, the capo di tutti capi. That was not always true. Before the 10th or 11th century, it was big, but not that big. The Pope was the Bishop of Rome and not much more. Between about 1087 and 1648, the political cloud of the Church rose and then fell. This happened, in my opinion, mostly because of a deal it struck with the Holy Roman Emperor in 1122 and with the kings of France and England at about the same time. The Pope has a great job. He lives in terrific digs right in the heart of Rome. He has a fabulous art collection, the best supply of Italian food anyone could want, and even his clothes, we must admit, are pretty cool. His hats are out of this world. He travels wherever he wants in grand style, and he is adored by millions of people. Still, it's not as good a job as it once was. The best time to be pope was between the papacies of Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, and Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303. Those were the days when popes really had it all: fame, glory, riches, sanctity, power. After that, they went into a long downward spiral, punctuated most noticeably by the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 formally made kings sovereign within their territorial boundaries. They could choose, or let the people choose, an idea whose time had not yet come, the religion for their domain. The closer a kingdom was to Rome, the more likely it was to remain Catholic. As one got farther from the Pope's reach, however, Protestants did better. Westphalia enshrined the idea that foreign power should not interfere with any country's internal policies. This really limited the Catholic Church's ability to dictate policies as it had done for centuries. Although the Treaty of Westphalia made these points explicit, they had been in the works for a long time. And the real action that made such conditions feasible started at least 5 centuries earlier, when the sale of bishops' positions was resolved by the Concordat of Worms. Historians have a quite different take on the development of modern sovereign states than I do. My view is shaped by the game that was set up at Worms. The standard account is that the Catholic Church promoted economic growth, banning usury only because it was sinful, and managed reverent kings who deferred to the Pope's choices of bishops, which gave the Vatican localized control over much of Europe. My perspective is that the Church actively tried to hinder economic growth in the secular realm and that kings only really deferred to papal choices for bishops where and when they were forced to for economic reasons. My view looks at the Church as a political power more than as a religious institution. Please understand, I am not questioning the sincerity of Catholic religious beliefs today, or at any time in the past. I am just recognizing that in addition to its religious mission, maybe because of it, the Catholic Church played power politics. I contend that, eventually, economic growth made the Pope all but irrelevant politically, and it was that very growth, and the contest for it, that made the terms of the Treaty of Westphalia ultimately possible. I will show how each of these developments was dictated by the strategic implications of Worms and, therefore, that each was predictable. Worms established a way for popes to sustain substantial power for a long time, but it also made inevitable that the Church would ultimately become subservient to the state. In that sense, the Pope of 1122, Calixtus II, did what was good for him and his immediate successors, but at the price of selling out the political prospects of popes centuries later. The agreement reached at Worms resolved the investiture struggle over bishops. Before Worms, the Holy Roman Emperor and Catholic king sold bishoprics within their domain. Naturally, the Pope objected to this practice. He wanted greater control over bishops. They were, after all, supposed to be his emissaries. Under the Concordat, the Pope gained the right to nominate bishops, and the king the right to approve or reject the nominees. When a new bishop was installed, the king gave up control over the symbols and trappings of the bishop's office, including its income. In exchange, the bishop promised military assistance and loyalty to the king as sovereign of the territory occupied by the bishopric. In this way, the king transferred back to the church, and to the bishop as its agent, the right to the tax revenues from the see. During the vacancy between the death of the old bishop and the consecration of the new one, the revenue from the bishopric went to the king. This revenue could be substantial. The longer the bishop's office remained vacant, the longer the king received the revenue instead of the church. But rejection of a papal nominee was bound to irritate the pope, and that could be politically and socially costly to the king. The pope could excommunicate the king, or he could interdict the bishopric. That meant that no one in the bishopric could receive any of the sacraments. This was tantamount to fomenting civil war against the king in that deeply religious age. The king's right to the see's income during a vacancy represented a property right that belonged to the king as sovereign over the territory of the see, and not to the king as an individual. The king could not sell the future right to control the regalia, nor could this right be inherited except by ascent to the throne. The right belonged to the king's successor, who might be his child or might be from an entirely new line. The king held the right to this income, then, as the kingdom's agent and not as his personal, private property. This was a significant departure from feudal practice. It established the sovereign claims of the monarch on behalf of his citizen subjects within the territory of each bishopric in his domain. It was the beginning of the state as we know it. Although the actual game set up at Worms is a bit more complicated than the model I present, the game tree in Figure 11.1 is close enough to capture the essentials. The Pope chooses to nominate a bishop. The nominee is either someone especially to the Pope's liking, or someone more to the liking of the king. The king, in turn, can agree to the Pope's nominee or reject him. If the king rejects the nominee, then he earns more money but annoys the Pope, who must then nominate someone else to be bishop. If the king agrees to the Pope's nominee, then the king earns less money because the bishopric does not remain vacant for long, but he improves his relations with the Pope. So as long as the Pope and the king agree on a nominee, both benefit, although in different ways. On acceptance of a bishop, earnings from the see benefit the Pope, and, depending on who the bishop is, the Pope either has a loyal ambassador, or the Pope relies on a person more loyal to the king than to the Pope, a potential fifth columnist within the Pope's circle. On agreement, the king has an acceptable bishop to work with, and if there is some delay between the death of the previous bishop and the installation of the new one, the king also gets some extra income. Figure 11.2 on the next page shows a simple version of this game. Fig. 11.1. The game set up at Worms in 1122. The Pope's choice looks pretty easy to make. If he nominates someone expected to be loyal to him, a relative or a member of his papal court, and the king accepts, the Pope gets his best choice as bishop and he gets the income from the see, eliminating the vacancy as quickly as possible. The problem is that the king might say no to this proposal. Okay, you think, so maybe the Pope should nominate someone loyal to the king. Then at least he gets the income. But the king could turn that offer down too. Here lies the kernel of the undoing of the Catholic Church 526 years later. Let's look at the king's choices with a numerical example to illustrate how this works. The scale of the numbers is not important here as long as the order of the size of the value to the Pope and to the king under different conditions is right. Setting aside for the moment the matter of income, let's say that the Pope values a bishop who will be loyal to him at 5 points and a bishop loyal to the king at only 3. Not getting the king to agree on a bishop at all is worth 0 points to the Pope. This order of values makes clear that the Pope prefers his own guy to the king's man, but he prefers the king's choice of bishop to no bishop at all. Let's say that the king places a value of 5 on a bishop who is related to him and a value of 3 on a bishop whose loyalty is expected to be with the Pope. The value of having no bishop at all is 0 for the king, just as it was for the Pope. Now comes the fun part. How much is the income from a bishopric worth? I will assume that a poor diocese produces an income worth 1 additional point for whoever gets the income. A moderately wealthy see's income is worth 4 points, and a really rich bishopric produces an income of 6. The game tree shows the Pope's benefits first and the king's below the Pope's at each place where the game tree ends. In Chapter 3, when we looked at the banker's game, Paris or Heidelberg, I promised a more interesting game later, and here it is. To solve the game, the Pope has to look ahead to figure out what the king is likely to do. The king's decision depends very much on how valuable the income is from the bishopric. When the diocese has a small income, just 1 extra point, the king can get 3 points by agreeing to the Pope's choice of a bishop loyal to the papacy, but only 1 point, the value of the income, by rejecting that nominee. Now, the king would of course do even better if the Pope chose one of the king's relatives to be bishop, then the king would receive 5 points in value by accepting the nominee. The Concordat of Worms, however, stipulates that the Pope moves first, nominating a candidate to be bishop. The Pope has worked out that if he nominates someone loyal to him he will get 6 points, 5 for the bishop and 1, in the case of this poor see, for the income. That is more than he can get by nominating a relative of the king. So in a poor bishopric, the Pope picks someone he likes, forcing the king's hand. The king agrees to the Pope's choice, and all is right with the world. This is the world that historians think prevailed because they noticed that kings almost never turn down a nominee to be bishop. Fig. 11.2. A numerical example of the game set up at Worms. The historians, however, are mistaken, in my opinion. If we look at differences in the income from dioceses in France, for instance, during the reign of Philip Augustus, 1179–1223, we discover that the Pope overwhelmingly chose people from his own court in poor dioceses, but he chose relatives of the king in moderately well-to-do bishoprics. That is exactly what the game set up at Worms back in 1122 leads us to expect, and that is the key fact that will make the Pope want to limit the economic growth that kings can tap into. When the income is worth 4 points instead of 1, the king gets more value by rejecting a candidate to be bishop who is a papal loyalist than from agreeing to the nominee, 4 points versus 3. But if the Pope chooses a relative of the king to be bishop, the king is better off saying yes to the candidate than saying no, even though this means giving up the bigger income. The king receives a value equal to 5 points if his relative becomes bishop and only 4 from the income earned in a moderately well-off bishopric. So in wealthier sees, an attentive, politically savvy Pope switches his strategy and gives the king someone the king wants. Then the Pope earns 3 points for the choice of bishop and another 4 in income. That is the best he can do when he knows the king has an incentive to reject a candidate for bishop that the Pope really wants. Now imagine a really wealthy diocese where the income is worth 6 points. The income from the diocese is worth even more to the king than getting along with the Pope. The church can no longer compete with the monarch for political control. The king just doesn't care about bishops anymore. He just wants the income, and so he rejects any and all nominees. The Concordat at Worms breaks down and we are in a new world in which kings keep incomes in their territory and popes can pick whomever they want as bishops. That, of course, is essentially the situation for the modern Catholic Church. It remains a major religious body, but it is not a major political military player. We can see that Worms set up a system that creates some interesting incentives. The higher the income from a see, the harder it is for the Pope to get his preferred candidate as bishop. Valuable sees require the Pope to make sacrifices. He has to agree to a bishop who in a pinch is more likely to support the king than the Pope, or else the Pope loses income. This gives the Pope a reason to stymie economic growth outside the Church's domain. In fact, shortly after 1122, the Church adopted a series of new programs that were likely to hinder economic progress outside the Church. Was that a coincidence? We cannot know. We can only see that changes introduced by the Church, and by kings, after 1122 were consistent with their new incentives created at Worms. For example, in the First Lateran Council, 1123, a gathering of church leaders to agree on important new rules, we can see that the role of celibacy for the clergy was made more important. The council prohibited the clergy from marrying or having concubines. The church was clear about the motivation behind the stricter celibacy rules. They seem not to have been designed to promote purity so much as to clarify the church's claims on property. The new rules improved the odds that the property of the clergy would belong to the church rather than to heirs. At the Second Lateran Council, 1139, more serious changes were instituted. This council dealt with questions of inheritance and usury. On the inheritance of the private property of deceased bishops, the church raised the stakes and ensured that they, and not any secular venue, would be the beneficiary. The goods of deceased bishops are not to be seized by anyone at all, but are to remain freely at the disposal of the treasurer and the clergy for the needs of the church and the succeeding incumbent. Furthermore, if anyone dares to attempt this behavior henceforth, he is to be excommunicated. And those who despoil the goods of dying priests or clerics are to be subject to the same sentence. 1. By imposing excommunication on violators, the Church raised the risks that families or monarchs ran in trying to seize the personal property of deceased clerics. That put the money right where the Church wanted it, in its coffers. The Council went on to make usury despicable and blameworthy by divine and human laws, and cut off usurers from the Church, depriving them even of a Christian burial unless they repented. Usury in those days just meant lending money with the expectation of making a profit, not necessarily a big profit as the term implies today. Before 1139, usury had been forbidden to the clergy, but it had not been elevated to a mortal sin for ordinary people. The effect of banning moneylending for profit was to raise the price of money and to create a potential shortage of would-be lenders. Just as modern-day central banks increase interest rates to slow growth, so the 12th century Church raised interest rates by denying heaven to those who lent money for profit. Though the Church used Scripture to justify its action, there was a widely held view among Church canonists, the Church's lawyers, that there was no doctrinal ban on usury in early Catholic teachings or Scripture. As they noted, Jesus threw the moneylenders out of the temple. He thought it wrong to engage in such business in the temple, but he did not argue that the business was wrong. He just wanted it taken outside. And of course we should remember that the Church had not used Scripture to ban usury in its preceding 1,000 years. Enforcing the ban on moneylending for profit, and why else would someone lend money, however, proved to be a difficult problem. The sin of usury required intent. The moneylender had to intend to make a profit, so whether the moneylender did or did not actually make a profit was beside the point. The church recognized how hard it was to determine whether a lender intended to make a profit. To deal with intent, the church wisely shifted enforcement from its lawyers to its theologians. They reasoned that while human law might fail to recognize a usurious loan, God knew whether a lender intended to make a profit no matter what subterfuge was used to mask the return. Therefore, anyone having made such a profit and failing to make restitution or to show sufficient contrition before death was condemned eternally. To facilitate restitution for usury, and to heighten the threat of damnation associated with lending, the Church established new institutions. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, for instance, made annual oral confession mandatory. The Church distributed confessors' manuals with specific instructions for dealing with merchants and others likely to have engaged in usury. Through the confessional, the Church provided a means by which those otherwise damned for usury could save their souls. The path to forgiveness, however, generally included making financial restitution to the Church rather than to those from whom a profit had been made. While the threat of eternal damnation was powerful indeed in the 12th century, still, moneylending continued. Of course, merchants and others continued to devise clever schemes to hide what they were doing. They not only manipulated exchange rates but also wrote misleading contracts and created false stock companies, sound familiar? To hide their true financial arrangements. The risks, including eternal damnation, had been raised, so naturally the expected rate of return had to rise too. The consequence was to make loans costlier and thereby to diminish money for investments and growth relative to what it otherwise would have been. If we look at last wills and testaments after 1215, we discover a great increase in deathbed confessions of usury. These confessions were frequently accompanied by wills that make penance by leaving money to the Church to make up for the dying sinner's usurious past. This was a great boon to church income and took a great deal of money out of the secular economy. It must have left relatives pretty unhappy, but how could they argue against the greater good of eternal salvation? During the 12th century, the Church also adopted new rhetoric that limited growth even as it promoted wealth within the Church's lands. At the same time that new mendicant orders like the Cistercians built and operated wind and water mills and other labor-saving devices to improve efficiency, the Church began to promote the view that idle hands are the work of the devil. The Church discouraged the spread of machines and other labor-saving technology in the secular realm, though not within its own domain. Certainly by discouraging the spread of labor-saving technology, the Church was reducing labor productivity and thereby economic growth in the lay sector. This, as we saw, could only improve the Pope's chances of getting the bishops he wanted. Kings, of course, did not sit idly by while the Pope worked to strengthen his hand and weaken theirs. The decades immediately after the Concordat of Worms saw a dramatic flowering of political institutions in England, in France, and elsewhere on the continent. Whether intentionally or not, many of these new institutions and programs challenged the Pope's influence and secured a higher economic growth rate for the king's subjects, and thus higher tax revenues for the king, higher, that is, than they would have been if the Pope's policies had been left unchallenged. Consider, for instance, the series of legal reforms introduced by Henry II, the Lion in Winter in England during the mid-12th century. These reforms became the foundation of English common law. Henry moved to protect property rights and rights of inheritance. These actions made it easier for peasant families to predict whether they would continue to benefit from the land they worked after the head of the family died or whether the lord of the manor would take away their opportunity to farm the land. Henry's writs greatly shortened the judicial process for determining rights of access to the land and made for a more smoothly operating agricultural system. His new rules proved highly popular and effective in securing the property rights that are essential to economic growth, and they enhanced the king's credibility as the person who would ensure order and justice in matters of property. Before the writs, tenant farmers were reluctant to invest in their land. But once Henry's writs protecting property rights were in place, more effort was made by those working the land to produce more, for their own benefit as well as for the benefit of the lord of the manor. Henry did not limit himself to improving property rights for ordinary people. He also acted to impose restrictions on church rights, a bold move indeed. Through a writ called Utrum, he asserted the king's primacy in determining whether a dispute belonged in his secular courts or in the church's ecclesiastical courts. Prior to Henry there was a presumption in favor of the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts. Utrum reversed this presumption among litigants in England, a presumption that had been in place since the time of William the Conqueror a century earlier. Finally, Henry also moved to protect the patronage system that gave landowners the benefit of choosing clerics for appointment in their personal churches. This ran directly counter to the efforts of the Church to take all such influence away from the secular domain, as is evident from the rulings in Lateran II, 1139, and III, 1179. Henry's effort to strengthen his hand against the Church was further reinforced by his use of the jury system to replace trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal decided innocence or guilt through the presumed intervention of God. Two common ordeals, both supervised by the Church, involved submersion of the accused in deep water or forcing the accused to hold a red-hot piece of iron for a prescribed amount of time. Failure to stay submerged for the prescribed time was taken as proof of guilt, as was the inability to hold the red-hot iron. As Henry's legal advisor observed at the time, guilt or innocence had more to do with the thickness of one's calluses or the ability to hold one's breath than anything else. The shift to a jury system helped weaken church institutions and income. Trials by ordeal were supervised by the clergy, who were well compensated for their participation. For instance, 2 priests are known to have been paid 10 shillings for blessing the ordeal pits near Bury St. Edmunds in 1166. At the time, a worker's daily wage was about 1 penny, and a villain and his entire family could be purchased for 22.2. So tens for a blessing was a significant amount of money. At 12 pennies to the shilling, the blessing cost the equivalent of 120 days of labor for an ordinary worker. That amounts to over $5,600 at the current U.S. minimum wage just to get the ordeal pit blessed. It's about double that when evaluated relative to the income of the average American worker rather than those earning just minimum wage. With the stroke of a pen, Henry cut church income substantially and increased his own by introducing the jury system. The administrative structure of the modern state also began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries. The king's right to levy taxes for reasons other than necessity gradually developed in exchange for political concessions to his subjects, most notably in 1297 when Edward I accepted Confirmatio Cartarum. Edward, in confirming the charter, acquiesced to the changes that had been wrought by Magna Carta 80 years earlier. King John had agreed to and then promptly reneged on the deal. These new tax revenues gave the king the ability to muster an army without having to rely on the intricate rights and restrictions implied by the feudal order. Consequently, the bishop's military guarantee to the king, through the lance, granted at Worms, diminished in importance. The pope, in contrast, continued to rely on feudal commitments to raise an army. King's courts at fixed locations in England and in France replaced the itinerant justice of an earlier time, thereby centralizing judicial control in the hands of the king, further diminishing the role of the church as an adjudicator of disputes and further emphasizing the king's territorial sovereignty. Additionally, kings began to claim that they ruled by divine right, thereby challenging the pope's special position as allegedly chosen by God. In the jockeying for control, both kings and church evolved new institutions and methods to foster or stymie economic growth and wrest political control. The eventual result of all of this competition was just what the game set up at Worms predicts. The church worked to keep income high within the ecclesiastic domain and low elsewhere. Kings worked to achieve the opposite, seeking control over courts and taxes wherever and whenever possible. Eventually, secular wealth became so great that, as the game implies, kings stopped caring who the bishops were. Kings no longer felt a need to keep the pope happy, and the dominance of the Catholic Church was replaced by the dominance of sovereign states in a secular world. Now that we have seen how we could peer ahead to the big picture 500 and more years after 1122, let's do the same for our own time. Let's take a look at the inconvenient truth that won Al Gore the Nobel Peace Prize. The world seems to be undergoing significant warming. The rise in temperature is melting ice in the North Atlantic and elsewhere, raising ocean levels and threatening to sink low-lying island nations and mainland coastal areas. The gathering of more ferocious storms promises years of destructive forces from wind and rain. Higher temperatures will push some temperate climates into the subtropical zone and some subtropical environments into the great stifling heat of the tropics. First, let me provide a little background on the issue of global warming. After years of debate, including warnings in the 1960s and 1970s of an approaching new ice age, there now seems to be broad agreement within the scientific community that the Earth's temperature is on the rise. How much of the rise is due to human activity and how much to a normal cycle in Earth's climate is less easily agreed on, mostly because the cycle seems much longer than available weather data. We know, for example, that the High Middle Ages, what we used to call the Dark Ages, were a warm period accompanied by rapid economic growth. We know things got colder, at least in Europe, roughly from the Renaissance until probably sometime in the 19th century. And we know things are getting warmer again. We also know the increase in temperature is larger than seems to have been true at any time over the past 1,000 or so years. 3. Of course, in the Earth's history 1,000 years is a short time, though on the human clock it is pretty long. Scientists seem to concur that the extra rise in temperature is associated with industrialization and modern chemical fertilizer farming, and that fossil fuel use is among the big culprits. Obviously, concern about global warming is strong enough that there are ongoing international efforts to bring it under control and even reverse it. What can game theory tell us about efforts like Kyoto, Bali, and Copenhagen? That is, international conferences to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, to find solutions to the real threat of global warming? What can we learn that will help us carve out a better future for our species and our environment in the centuries to come? Frankly, we will see that agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and the efforts at Bali or Copenhagen to reduce greenhouse emissions, especially carbon dioxide emissions, are not likely to matter. They may even be impediments to real solutions. That is not to say that there is not good hope for the future. There is, because global warming produces its own solutions. Back in December 1997, 175 countries, not including the United States, signed the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto signatories agreed to a benchmark year, 1990, against which to establish targets for greenhouse gas reductions. Greenhouse gas emissions had been rising dramatically in the years between the benchmark and the agreement. The protocols call for a 5.2% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to their levels in 1990. That is about equivalent to saying there should be nearly a 30% reduction when compared to the then expected emissions levels in 2010. Some signatories were called upon to make much greater sacrifices than others. For instance, the European Union agreed to reduce its emissions by 8%. The United States was asked to reduce its greenhouse gases by 7%, Japan by 6%, and so forth. A few countries, such as Australia, were given permission to increase their emissions. No restrictions were imposed on developing countries like India and China, or Russia, assigned a 0% reduction, although they are now among the world's largest greenhouse gas polluters. The United States declined to sign on because it objected to the exemption given to rapidly growing economies like China's and India's. Kyoto produced a large market in which polluters and non-polluters could buy and sell pollution rights. This market has helped to rationalize decisions at the level of individual firms, but it alone has so far failed to result in the magnitude of reductions envisioned by the Kyoto Protocol. As we will see shortly, enforcing the 1997 agreement has been virtually impossible. One consequence of the difficulties encountered since 1997 was a meeting in Bali, Indonesia, in December 2007. The Bali meeting had more modest goals than Kyoto. It represents an interim step on the way to a 2009 deadline by which it is hoped there will be a new international agreement in Copenhagen. After considerable resistance, the U.S. representative at Bali agreed to significant concessions at the last minute. This made it possible to set out the Bali roadmap for future climate control. Now the question is, will these efforts work? To address the prospects for controlling greenhouse emissions, especially carbon dioxide, let's start with some data that reflect the views of the big players on global warming. These are the governments and interest groups with the most at stake. In all likelihood, any agreement that can be reached will be settled primarily among these few stakeholders. They include the European Union, the United States, divided between the proportion of American public opinion that favors regulating carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions and those opposed, China and India. It also includes other relatively large economies such as Russia's, Japan's, Canada's, and Australia's, plus the growing economy of Brazil. For good measure, I have also represented environmental non-governmental organizations, labeled here as NGOs, since they had a significant presence at Bali, and pro-environment and less sympathetic multinational corporations. In each case I have estimated potential influence in negotiations over an agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol. Position, explained in a moment. Salience for mandatory emission controls, and the extent to which the stakeholder is committed to finding an agreement, even if it is not the one they favor, or will stick to their guns under political pressure, holding out for the policy they believe in. This last variable, as you know, is new to the new model I have been developing and testing for a few years. This is the model that I promised earlier I would apply to this case, just as I applied it to forecasts about Pakistan and other crises in the previous chapter. I have rated the players' positions on a scale from 0 to 100. A position of 50 is equivalent to continuing the greenhouse gas targets that came out of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. These standards, as I previously discussed, called for rollbacks based on 1990 emission levels. Higher values on the position scale reflect tougher standards. For example, 60 is a 10% toughening of standards relative to the 1990 benchmark, 100 a 50% increase in mandatory greenhouse emissions reductions compared to 1990. Likewise, values below 50 reflect a weakening of the terms contained in the Kyoto Agreement. 10 years passed between the Kyoto negotiations and the new round of talks that began in Bali in 2007. There were intermediate discussions in 2000 and 2001, but these were not particularly dramatic. With that in mind, I have viewed the bargaining periods as fairly long, taking exchanges of ideas among the big players about how to deal with global warming as cycling around about once every 5 years. That means I have simulated the negotiated standards out for about 125 years. That is certainly a long time. We will want to take more seriously the predictions closer in than farther out, since a great deal can happen between now and 2130, when none of us will be around to check on accuracy or praise success. Because so much can happen, I have simulated the data with random shocks to salience and to each stakeholder's interest in building consensus or sticking to its guns. By randomly changing 30% of the salience values and 30% of the flexibility values in each bargaining round, we can look at a range of predicted futures to see whether the global warming simulations reveal strong trends. That will help us sort out how confident we can be about the toughness or weakness of future regulations of greenhouse gas emissions. First, let's see what the big picture looks like. Then we will examine the simulations in more detail to get a sense of how optimistic or pessimistic we should be. The heavy solid black line in figure 11.2 shows the most likely emission standard predicted by the game. The two heavy dotted lines depict the range of regulatory values that we can be 95% confident includes the true future regulatory environment according to the simulations. That range of values is pretty narrow, encompassing barely 5 points up or down through about 2050. After that, as we should expect, there is more uncertainty, but even as far into the future as 2130 the range is only about 10 points up or down, so these are probably pretty reliable forecasts. Fig. 11.2 The withering will to regulate greenhouse gases. The most likely value, the heavy solid line, reflects our best estimate of what the big players might broadly agree to if the global warming debate continues without any significant new discoveries in its favor or against it. It tells us two stories. First, the rhetoric of the next 20 or 30 years endorses tougher standards than those proposed, and mostly ignored, at Kyoto in 1997. We know this because the predicted value through 2025 is above 50 on the scale. That's the green part of the story. Second, support for tougher regulations falls almost relentlessly as the world closes in on 2050, a crucial date in the global warming debate. When we get to 2050, the mandatory standard being acted on is well below that set at Kyoto. By about 2070 it is down to 30, representing a significant weakening in standards. By 2100 it is closing in on 20 to 25. There's no regulatory green light left in the story by its end. Now let's probe the details a bit. The figure shows us that there are some considerably more optimistic scenarios and also some considerably more pessimistic views that fall outside the 95% confidence interval. The most optimistic and pessimistic scenarios are depicted by the dotted lines at the top and bottom of the figure. The most optimistic scenario predicts no rollback in emission controls. It never dips below 50 on the scale. In fact, most of the time in this scenario the predicted level of greenhouse gas reduction hovers around 60, implying a 10% or so tougher standard than was agreed to in Kyoto. The pro-control faction in the United States is the driving force behind this optimistic perspective. Their salience rises from its initial level of 70 and remains remarkably high, hovering around 100. Because the issue becomes so salient to them, this U.S. group's power, resources multiplied by salience, comes to dominate debate. Although their inclination to be tough might not be enough to satisfy die-hard Greens, keeping this group, mostly liberal Democrats, highly engaged is the best hope for tougher standards. Only about 10% of the scenarios, however, look optimistic enough to anticipate even holding the line at the standard set in the Kyoto Protocol. In contrast, there are dozens of scenarios in which the standard falls close to zero, indicating abandonment of the effort to regulate greenhouse gases. Typically in these scenarios, some mix of Brazil's, India's, and China's salience rises while the salience of the pro-control faction in the United States and in the European Union drops well below their opening stance. They just seem to lose interest in greenhouse gas regulations. That decline raises its ugly head especially during global economic slowdowns, so global economic patterns are critical for us to watch as they can guide our choice of the scenarios that we should pay the most attention to. Without commitment to change by the European Union and the United States, it becomes much easier for the key developing economies to prevail with the support and even encouragement of the anti-control American faction, mostly conservative Republicans. Since many of my 20, 30, and even 40-year-old readers will be around in 2050, I hope you will remember to take your dusty copy of this book off the shelf then and compare the greenhouse gas predictions to the reality with which you are then living. Perhaps you'll even think to write to my children, or their children, just to say whether I got it right or wrong. So far, there is little basis for believing greenhouse gases will be regulated away. Just in case you're still a believer in a Kyoto-style regulatory regime, but one with teeth, figure 11.3 zooms in on the biggest of the big players, at least the biggest for now: the European Union, the two US factions, China, and India. Americans who worry about global warming, like their European Union brethren, remain committed through about 2030 or 2040 to tougher standards than were announced in Kyoto. But after that, they join forces with those who put economic growth ahead of regulating carbon dioxide and other emissions. We'll see shortly why that may not be so bad. The voice that dominates debate after 2040 or so is the voice of Americans who today are not convinced global warming is for real. The Chinese and the Indians support that American perspective, in the process convincing the other big players to adopt even weaker standards than those that were not enforced after Kyoto. Of course, there is little reason to think that these standards will be enforced either. I took a look at an enforcement issue, and believe me, it is not a pretty picture. No one among the real decision makers remains in favor of putting real teeth behind global climate change standards. All of this may be leaving you rather depressed, but perhaps it shouldn't. The likely solution to global warming lies in the competitive technology game that global warming itself helps along. It doesn't depend on the regulatory schemes that are so popular among the world's nations. These schemes, well-intentioned though they are also predictably vacuous. They are exercises in what game theorists call cheap talk. Promises are easily made but not easily enforced. Just look at the record of the signatories to the Kyoto Protocol. Fig. 11.3. What will the biggest polluters do about greenhouse gas emissions? Although the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to in December 1997, it did not take effect until February 2005. That is rather a long time for moving from agreement to presumed action on a matter of long-term global survival. Of the 175 countries, including 35 developed economies, that ratified the agreement, 137 don't have to do anything except monitor and report on their greenhouse emissions. Counted among those 137 are China, India, and Brazil. With their growing economies and their large populations, these countries are among the world's great greenhouse gas emitters. They won the battle in the negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol. They preserved their right to continue to pollute with no punishment for failing to do otherwise. That's what cheap talk is all about. How about Japan, one of the world's big economies that signed on to Kyoto? Remember, Japan's target is a 6% reduction from its 1990 emissions. The Japanese government has stated that it cannot meet its emission reduction target. Britain, while making progress on some dimensions, seems incapable of meeting its pledged reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from its 1990 level by 2010. The picture isn't pretty. To be sure, several European Union states seem to be on track, and Russia does too, but then outside the oil sector the Russian economy has not done that well, and the Russians are only required not to increase emissions. One sure way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions is to have the economy slow down. Of course, that raises difficult political problems because people tend to vote against parties that produce poor economic performance. That could be a problem in the European Union. It's not likely to be an issue in Russia, where democracy seems to be a victim of increased oil prices. A global economic crash, however, will bring the price of oil down, and that could jeopardize Russia's march back to autocracy. Anyway, what all of this amounts to is a record of cheap promises. It is easy to get governments to sign on to deals that have no teeth, no clear way to keep track of violators and to punish them. Kyoto relies heavily on self-reporting, self-policing, and goodwill. That's no way to make a global arrangement that gets its signatories to make the sacrifices needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If I sound downbeat, I am sorry. Actually, I am most optimistic for the future. My optimism, however, is despite agreements like the one struck in Bali or Kyoto or Copenhagen. These will be forgotten in the twinkling of an eye. They will hardly make a dent in global warming. They could even hurt by delaying serious changes. Roadmaps like the one set out at Bali make us feel good about ourselves because we did something. We looked out for future generations, we promised to do good, or did we? Unlike the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor who signed on to worms, universal schemes do not put big change into motion. Their all-inclusiveness ensures that they reflect the concerns of the lowest, not the highest, common denominator. Deals like Bali and Kyoto include just about every country in the world. Such agreements suffer from the same wrong incentives and weak commitments as Arthur Andersen's management did in auditing Enron. To get everyone to agree to something potentially costly, the something they actually agreed to must be neither very demanding nor very costly. If it is, many will refuse to join because for them the costs are greater than the benefits, or else they will join while free riding on the costs paid by a few who are willing to bear them. That is akin to the tragedy of the commons. We all promise to protect what we hold in common, such as the earth, and then some of us cheat on the sly to enrich ourselves, figuring our little bit of cheating doesn't do any real harm. Remember, defecting is the dominant strategy in the prisoner's dilemma. To get people to sign a universal agreement and not cheat, the deal must not ask them to change their behavior much from whatever they are already doing, whether that is cleaning up their neighborhood or making it dirtier. It is a race to the bottom, to the lowest common denominator. More demanding agreements weed out prospective members or encourage lies. Kyoto's demands weeded out the United States, ensuring that it could not succeed. Maybe that is what those who signed on, or at least some of them, were hoping for. They can look good and then not deliver, because after all it wouldn't be fair for them to cut back when the biggest polluter, the USA, does not. When an agreement is demanding, lots of signatories cheat. When it isn't demanding, there is lots of compliance with what little is asked for, but then there is also little if any beneficial effect. Sacrificing self-interest for the greater good just doesn't happen very often. Governments don't throw themselves on hand grenades. Point 4. It really isn't easy being green, just as Kermit the Frog has been telling us for years. Who will monitor green cheaters? The answer: interest groups, not governments, and interest groups are rarely a match for governments. Who will punish the cheaters? The answer: practically no one. The cheaters-to-be were among the rulemakers when they agreed to the Universal Protocol. Cheating is an equilibrium strategy for many polluters, a strategy backed by the good faith and credit of their governments. Why will governments back cheaters? The answer: incentives, incentives, incentives. Who has what incentives? There is a natural division between the rich countries whose prosperity does not depend so much on toasting our planet and the poor countries who really have no affordable alternative, yet, to fossil fuels and carbon emissions. They have an incentive to do whatever it takes to improve the quality of life of the people they govern. The rich have an incentive to encourage the fast-growing poor to be greener, but the fast-growing poor have little incentive to listen as long as they are still poor. As the Indian government is fond of noting, sure, they are growing rapidly in income and in carbon dioxide emissions, but they are still a pale shadow of what rich countries like the United States have emitted over the centuries when they were going from poor to rich. If the poor listened to the rich, they could be in big political trouble. And when the fast-growing poor surpass the rich, the tables will turn. China, India, Brazil, and Mexico will then cry out for environmental change because that will protect their future advantaged position, while the relatively poor of that day, 100 or 200 or 300 years from now, will resist policies that hinder their efforts to climb to the top. The rich will even fight wars to keep the rising poor from getting so rich that they threaten the old political order. The rising poor will win those wars, by the way. There is also a natural division between politicians whose constituents care about the planet more than they care about their short-term quality of life, Those are few and far between, and politicians whose constituents say they care about the planet but in reality often vote growth, not green. If you doubt it, take a look at the election record of green parties around the democratic world. Moreover, who will endure the political and economic costs when poor countries trot out starving children? Children who would not be starving if their families could just keep on burning cow dung. We are quicker to be soft-hearted than we are to be green, and really, is that so bad? So how might we solve global warming and make the world in 500 years look attractive to our future selves? We 21st century folk know of well over 100 chemical elements and a long list of forces of nature. In Christopher Columbus's time, people pretty much only knew rain, wind, fire, and earth. They also knew hardly anything about exploiting rain, wind, and fire, but we sure do, and surely we will know more in the future. Rain, wind, and fire, they can and will solve global warming for future generations. I interpret the figures above to suggest that the reason mandatory emission standards will not be so high in 2050 is because few will care to fight that fight. It won't matter. New wind, rain, and solar technologies will be solving the problem for us. Climate change due to global warming will add to our supply of rain, wind, and fire, and if it raises the oceans, kicks up fierce storms, and bathes us in massive quantities of BTUs, then it also adds to our urge to exploit these ancient forces just as their increased power makes us worry more. As climate change would generate more of these sources of energy, it would also create a beautiful synergy which would in turn prevent global disaster. How could this be? There is an equilibrium at which enough global warming, a very modest amount more than we may already have, probably enough to be here in 50 to 100 years, as suggested by the game's analysis, will create enough additional sunshine in cold places, enough additional rain in dry places, enough additional wind in still places, and, most important, enough additional incentives for humankind that windmills, solar panels, hydroelectricity and as yet undiscovered technologies will be the good, cheap, evenly distributed, and clean mechanisms to replace the fossil fuels we use today. Global warming, in other words, induces a self-solving dominant strategy in which everyone elects some mix of wind, rain, and fire technologies, and maybe even some fossil fuels in moderation, precisely because the abundance of these forces, and the attention drawn to them, will make them affordable solutions to arrest further warming, long before we all roast, drown, or are blown beyond the moon, beyond the stars, and all the way to Oz. I am optimistic for the long future. We have already warmed enough for there to be all kinds of interesting research going on into using wind and rain and solar fire. Already there are serious discussions of solar panels and cosmic ray catchers in space, and more windmill farms will sprout up on Earth. Today such pursuits take more sacrifice than most people seem willing to make. Tomorrow that might not be true, and at that point, I doubt it'll be too late. And, looking out 500 years, we'll probably have figured out how to beam ourselves to distant planets where we can start all over, warming our solar system, our galaxy, and beyond with abandon. Remember, we're looking out for numero uno. Acknowledgements. Every author happily accumulates indebtedness. This is certainly true for me. I have been doing political forecasting and engineering for nearly 30 years cloaked in academic obscurity. 3 people have been instrumental in bringing attention to my research beyond the world of political science. Michael Lerner wrote a cover story on my Predictioneering for Good magazine. Thanks to that article, Eric Lupfer, my literary agent at the William Morris Agency, suggested that I write a book on the subject. Without Michael's article and without Eric's encouragement, it would never have occurred to me that people might find this work of interest. Jonathan Zhao, my editor at Random House, then turned Eric's idea and my pages into this book. I am deeply grateful to each of them for inspiring me to do this. Eric deserves additional thanks for being much more than a literary agent. He worked tirelessly at editing, rearranging, and prodding to make this a better book. I am happy to count him as my friend as well as my business associate. My family, friends, colleagues, and students have also contributed mightily to this effort. My wife, Arlene, has given me not only the benefit of her critique of sections of this book, but her love and support for all that I do during our more than 40 years together. My daughter Erin and her husband, Jason, 2 French horn players, not only make great music together but bring great harmony to my life. My son, Ethan, a much better applied game theorist and professor than I can ever hope to be, and his wife, Rebecca, a rabbi and an educator, add further to the harmony of my life. My daughter Gwen and her husband, Adam, 2 of the most fashionable and business-savvy people I know, add harmony while trying desperately, and hopelessly, to improve my sartorial splendor. They have all given me good ideas and honest feedback as this book took shape. Indeed, the title originated in a brainstorming session with Adam and Gwen, herself a terrific writer. I also owe special thanks to my sisters Marae and Judy, 2 great teachers and creative spirits. Martin Feinberg, Sam Gubens, Mary Jackman, Robert Jackman, Russell Roberts, Joseph Sherman, and Thomas Wasow discussed the ideas in this book with me and have given me the benefit of their insight and their friendship for many years. Equally, I have benefited from my friends and co-authors George Downs, James Morrow, Randolph Siverson, and Alistair Smith, who were my partners in developing some of the ideas that shaped this book. Likewise, my friend and business partner, Harry Roundell, has been front and center in the analysis of many of the cases reported here and has been a source of deep and enduring support. My spring 2008 students, James Henry Aarons, Jessica Carano, Thomas DeLillo, Emily Levile, Christopher Lotz, Catherine McNish, Christian Marie, Deborah O., Catherine Elaine Otto, Silpa Ramaneni, David Roberts, Andrea Schifferl, Jae Hyung Shim, Jennifer Ann Thompson, Michael Vanunu, Stefan Villani, Paloma White, Natalie Wilson, Stephanie Woodburn, and Angela Zhu, and my spring 2009 students, Daniel Barker, Alexandra Baer, Catherine Chang, Noor El-Dajani, Natalie Engdahl, Sanishia Fernando, Emily Font, Mihal Harari, Andrew Hurst, Ashley Helsing, Tipper Laguno, Veronica Mazariegos, Eric Min, Linda Moon, Shayna Negron, David Skimich, Kelly Siegel, Milan Sundarsan, Kenneth Villa, and Yang Yang Zhou, served as willing guinea pigs who helped shape the chapter, Dare to be Embarrassed. All are innocent of responsibility for the remaining deficiencies in this book, and each certainly helped eliminate many. I am particularly grateful for the support of the Alexander Hamilton Center for Political Economy at NYU. The Predictioneer's game is the embodiment of its commitment to logic and evidence in pursuit of solutions to policy problems, and to Shanasi Rama, its deputy director, and to those whose generous support makes the center possible, especially the Veritas Fund, the Thomas W. Smith Foundation, the Lehrman Institute, David Desrosiers, James Pearson, and especially Roger Hertog, without whom there could not be an Alexander Hamilton Center. My colleagues in the Wilf Family Department of Politics at New York University and at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University are an endless source of support and inspiration. I could not have asked for better environments in which to pursue my research. Random House has been a terrific organization to work with, providing superb and subtle copy editing and bringing the highest standards to every aspect of this work. I thank them for their help. Finally, I want to remember Kenneth Organsky, my professor, co-author, and friend, and the inspiration behind the original decision to apply my forecasting model to problems in the real world. He died too soon, but he left a legacy that will endure forever. Appendix I: Calculation of the weighted mean prediction for North Korea. The table below shows detailed data for some of the 56 stakeholders in the North Korean nuclear game, and it provides the summary values for influence times salience, that is, power, and also for influence times salience times position for all of the players. The column I times S times P is summed and divided by the sum of the column for I times S, that is, the weighted mean position equals 1,757,649 divided by 29,384 equals 59.8. This number is approximately equal to the position designated as slow reduction, U.S. grants diplomatic recognition. A sample of data, with the calculation of the weighted mean position. Appendix IIDATA used to engineer a complex litigation. Afterward to the paperback edition. Here we are, just about 1 year since the Predictioneer's game first went to press. A lot has been going on in the world since then, giving us a terrific opportunity to look back and see how the forecasting model did. Of course, it will be much more convincing if you go back over the book's predictions, as well as forecasts I have made online in speeches, podcasts, and so forth, and judge for yourself. There is always the danger that I will unwittingly focus on the best of my predictions and give less credence to those that were wrong, but I will certainly try not to do that. Besides, you can take the model out for a test drive yourself. Just go to predictioneersgame.com and click on the game page. You will have the opportunity to use the apprentice version of the model with your own datasets. There's also a training manual on the game page to help you understand how to build inputs for the model. You won't get the full output, just the parts intended for prediction rather than engineering, but you should have considerable fun playing with it, and you'll be able to keep track of your own accuracy as a predictioneer. And if you are a professor teaching a course that can use the model, then you can register for a fuller version online. Besides being able to play the game yourself, you are going to have the opportunity to understand more about how it works. You'll get to look under the hood as well as kick the proverbial tires. Sorry for all the car talk, but then, I did offer advice on how to buy a car. Some readers are gluttons for punishment. They don't want to pick up my, admittedly boring, academic publications to find out the nuts and bolts behind my models. They want it here and they want it now. Okay, I'll provide some of those details as an appendix to this epilogue so that those who really don't want to look at equations needn't be bothered, and those who do want to look at some math will, hopefully, be satisfied. This just isn't the place to go into full detail. Now, back to the predictions and claims of the book. Let's start with the approach I suggested for buying a car. That's not strictly derived from the forecasting model, but it is based on the strategic thinking at the heart of game theory. Some readers have tried my method out and reported on their results, and so far all are positive. Paul Daugherty, who happens to be a journalist, was an admitted skeptic. He tried the method and wrote up the results in the Irish Times on October 28, 2009. I'll let him do the talking. So, we put it to the test. Our goal was to see what sort of discount we could get if we tested the market for a Ford Mondeo 1.8. Petrol saloon with around 50,000 miles on the clock, preferably in metallic silver for less than €9,000. I pitched my wits against the car dealers of Ireland, trying to buy a car the Bruce Bueno de Mesquita way. Picking out 5 cars on the internet that fitted the criteria, I started in Dublin, rang the first dealership on my list and gave the salesperson the following spiel. Hello, my name is Paul O'Doherty. I need to buy a car urgently. At noon tomorrow I will walk into a dealership with cash to buy a 2005 Ford Mondeo 1.8. Petrol saloon with around 50,000 miles on the clock from the dealer who offers me the best price. You are the first person I've rung and I have 4 others on my list. What's your best price? Lastly, I rang a Kildare dealer with an opening price of €6,900. Delivering what I had to say, the best price returned was €6,750 with the final warning that this price wouldn't be beaten. And, in fairness, it wasn't. Summing up, the Bruce Bueno de Mesquita way certainly cut through a lot of the haggling and allowed me to sidestep the obvious, well, how much are you offering? Or, you'll have to call in and see us. It also got me to the nitty-gritty of price much faster, and all from the comfort of my own home, saving in one case €2,450 off the opening price. Not bad for less than 10 minutes work on the phone. Mr. Daugherty is not the only one to report success. During an interview on Michael Krasny's National Public Radio Show Forum, a caller who said he had used the car buying method claimed to have saved $2,000. Krasny also acknowledged having used the method, though he said he had done so before reading the book, and said he believed he had saved $1,000. If you're going to buy a car, please try my method and send me a comment to post on the book's website. Car buying is one thing. Accurately predicting big national security issues is another. In Chapter 10 you saw me daring to be embarrassed, making predictions that were about the future at the time when I was originally writing that chapter. Now we can look back over the last few months of 2009 and the first quarter of 2010 to see how I did. Let's start with developments in Pakistan. I raised 3 pretty big questions about how Pakistan's policy was likely to unfold. They were: how willing would the Pakistani government be to pursue militant groups operating in and around Pakistan, including Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani Taliban, and the Afghan Taliban? Will the Pakistani government allow U.S. military forces to use Pakistani territory to launch efforts to track down militants? What level of U.S. foreign aid to Pakistan was likely to change the Pakistani leadership's approach to pursuing militants? Within the context of these big-picture issues, the game was used to make several more detailed predictions. Here's a list, with page references, of those predictions, accompanied by brief accounts of what has happened. Prediction: on this page, the Zardari government, without support from Sharif, would depose Musharraf in June or July 2008. Outcome: the Zardari government actually forced Musharraf to step down in August. Prediction: on this page, the militants and the Pakistani government would negotiate an accommodation. After June 2008, the government would pay only lip service to going after the militants, and the Bush administration would prove unable to change its mind in the absence of a fundamental shift in foreign aid policy. Outcome: there is scant evidence of a concerted effort by the Zardari government to fight the militants in the latter half of 2008. There was a brief military offensive against the Taliban begun on June 28, which ended in early July with 1 militant killed. After that, although the Taliban aggressively pursued expansion, the government did little in response. Rather than fight the militants, the government made a deal with the Taliban in February 2009, paying them about $6 million and agreeing to the imposition of Sharia law in the Swat Valley in exchange for the Taliban agreeing to an indefinite ceasefire. The ceasefire unraveled in May. The model did not address how long the agreement would last but did correctly foresee that the two sides would strike a deal after a half-year of seeming Pakistani indifference toward the militant threat. Prediction: on this page, the Pakistani military would decline in power faster than the government. This was predicted to produce a heightened risk of a coup between February and June 2009. The model also predicted that by midsummer a coup would become unlikely. Outcome: although there was talk of a potential coup to bring Zardari down and that talk continued into the fall of 2009, no coup was launched and Zardari remains in power with no current hints that the military is trying to depose him. This is consistent with the model's conditional forecast: if no coup, then. Prediction: on this page, the U.S. government would switch from its two-pronged approach, clandestine pursuit of militants by the United States and open pursuit of militants by the Pakistani government, to greater emphasis on direct use of the American military in Pakistan. Outcome: U.S. drone attacks against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets in Pakistan have experienced a tremendous upsurge and are no longer treated as clandestine. Indeed, the U.S. military has allowed American TV broadcasts showing drones being controlled remotely from military bases in the United States. The U.S. government seems to be continuing, as well, to use American armed forces inside Pakistan's borders. In early February 2010, 3 Americans were killed in a Pakistani roadside bombing, drawing attention to the barely acknowledged role of the U.S. military in training and otherwise assisting against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. These outcomes echo the model's predictions. As we will see, the timing of changes in Pakistan's approach to militants is also consistent with the model's expectations. Prediction: on this page, if the United States provided the Pakistani government with $1.50 billion in aid, while looking the other way regarding some misappropriation of the aid by Pakistani leaders, then the Pakistani government and military would aggressively pursue militants inside its borders but would not be so aggressive as to shut down the militants completely. Doing so would, after all, put the flow of aid dollars at risk. Outcome: The Kerry-Lugar Aid Bill was passed at the end of September 2009. It allocated $1.50 billion to Pakistan, tripling aid from its level 1 year earlier. The bill contained strong language restricting how the Pakistani government could use the money and required an accounting of expenditures. The Pakistani government balked at taking the aid. Senator John Kerry clarified that the bill was not designed to interfere at all with sovereign Pakistani decisions. That is, he essentially assured the Pakistani leadership that the United States would not closely monitor use of the funds. Shortly afterward, the Pakistani government greatly stepped up its pursuit of militants operating within its borders. By February 2010 they had captured the number 2 Taliban leader, but so far they have certainly not terminated the Taliban's ability to fight back. This is as predicted. On the negative side, I presumed, with some evidence within the model's results, that the US government was unlikely to grant Pakistan $1.50 billion. Still, this was treated as a contingency rather than a firm prediction. The model led to firm predictions under the contingency of less than $1.50 billion in aid, little effort against the militants, and under the contingency of $1.50 billion in aid, significant effort against the militants. The first contingency is consistent with Pakistani efforts prior to passage of the aid bill. The model was accurate regarding the consequences of giving Pakistan $1.50 billion in aid after September 2009, and it is noteworthy that the analysis also led to the conclusion that there was no reason to give Pakistan more than $1.50 billion per year. Congress got that right. Results out of Pakistan are largely consistent with the model's predictions, both in terms of the big picture, given that forecasts were made under alternative contingencies, and in terms of lots of nitty-gritty detail. So far, so good. How about the other big predictions in the chapter? Dare to be embarrassed. They were about Iran-Iraq relations after the summer of 2010 and were contingent on whether the United States keeps troops in Iraq or fully withdraws. As I am writing in March 2010, we do not yet know which contingency will arise. We will just have to be patient and wait to see what happens during the period covered by the predictions. That, after all, is the point of the chapter. Meanwhile, perhaps some Iran and Iraq specialists would care to put into print what they believe will happen, and why, if the United States stays in or pulls out completely. Finally, the last chapter discussed what was likely to come out of the Copenhagen Summit on climate change. As I was writing the chapter, there was widespread optimism that Copenhagen would be a turning point leading to serious efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here are just a few statements on expectations for Copenhagen written roughly around the time when the Predictioneers game was used to evaluate prospects for Copenhagen, and some written even later, when the authors of the reports cited had access to more information with which to form expectations. The architecture of the Copenhagen Treaty should initiate a race to the top. Copenhagen has the potential to give the world a clear path to rapidly bending the global emissions curve, and give millions of people and species a chance at survival. World Wildlife Federation, WWF expectations for the Copenhagen Climate Deal 2009, March 2009. WorldWildlife.org. In a report on German government expectations, Germanwatch reported, important and decisive steps have been taken in Bali. They give reason to believe that a new global agreement on climate protection for the time after 2012, i.e. following the expiration of the Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period, will come into effect. Bali, Poznan, Copenhagen, triple jump towards a new quality of climate policy? Germanwatch.org. And in a report from Time 1 year ahead of Copenhagen, Brian Walsh. What to expect from the UN Climate Change Summit, December 10, 2008. Time.com. France's climate ambassador, Brice Lalonde, said of the then upcoming Copenhagen Summit, "We hope for a spectacular outcome in Copenhagen next year." Meanwhile, using data put together by my students, the game's forecast was for failure at Copenhagen, and that, sadly, is just what we got. The predictions thus far have been pretty well borne out by subsequent events, so there is not much to be embarrassed about. Rather, the match between predictions and outcomes over the past year may be seen as encouraging to those who believe that through the transparent application of logic and evidence we can anticipate and perhaps influence the course of events for the better. The model's success continues to garner the attention of people making high-stakes decisions and is stimulating others to teach game theory-based political forecasting. The model's performance and online availability is even helping to bring this particular rational actor approach into the classroom in new arenas, including graduate programs in social work, psychiatry, and business and in military training. That is most gratifying. With a bit of luck, we may see further integration of a more rational approach to how we understand the decisions and actions of others. Then we may be better able to use that understanding to inform our own decisions, corporate decisions, and decisions in the arena of national security, helping to make the world a more peaceful, more just, and happier place for all of us. Appendix to the paperback edition because some of you asked for it. The figure on this page illustrates a single stage game for a single pair of players, call them A and B, while not displaying the sources of uncertainty in the model. Nature assigns initial probabilities of 0.5 to player types, and the model then applies Bayes' rule so that the players can update their beliefs. There are 16 possible combinations of beliefs about the mix of player types. Each player is uncertain whether the other player is a hawk or a dove or whether the other player is pacific or retaliatory. By hawk I mean someone who prefers to compel a rival to give in to the hawk's demands even if this necessitates both imposing and enduring costs rather than compromising on the policy outcome. A dove prefers to compromise rather than engage in costly coercion to get the rival to give in. A retaliatory player prefers to defend himself, at potentially high costs, rather than be bullied into giving in, while a pacific player prefers to give in to avoid further costs. The game is iterated so that payoffs can change from round to round, with a round defined as a sequence of moves through the stage game in the figure. Because the game is solved for all directional pairs, it assumes that players do not know whether they will be moving first, second, or simultaneously with each other player. The game ends, by assumption, when the sum of player payoffs in an iteration is greater than the projected sum of those payoffs in the next iteration. Structure of the game. Sketch of one of end-to-end stage. Games played simultaneously. A and B uncertain whether other will retaliate if coerced. A and B uncertain whether other will coerce if given the chance. In playing the game, each player's initial move is to choose whether to make proposals. A proposal is expressed as a demand that another player accept some specific change in his position that is favorable to the demander. Players choose proposals designed to maximize their welfare at the end of the stage game. In practice, this means choosing proposals that make the other players indifferent between imposing costs on the demander and preferring a negotiated compromise instead. Of course, the endogenous selection of proposal values must take into account player beliefs about the rival's type. Payoffs are calculated as follows. Let the probability that A prevails in an iteration of the game versus C is the potential clout or influence of each stakeholder, S is the salience each stakeholder attaches to the issue, and U denotes utility with the first subscript indicating whose utility is being evaluated and the second vis of vis which other players' approach to the issue. Let x1k equals player k's policy preference on the issue. Let x2k equals player k's preference over reaching agreement or being resolute on the issue. Let A's utility for B's approach to the issue. With. That is, the model assumes that players prefer a mix of gains based on sharing resolve or flexibility to settle and based on the issue outcome sought over fully satisfying themselves on one dimension while getting nothing on the other. The structure of the utility of proposals is comparably computed but with positions chosen endogenously rather than necessarily being either player's policy position. The model assumes four sources of costs. 1. Alpha, the cost of trying to coerce and meeting resistance. 2. Tau, the cost of being coerced and resisting. 3. Gamma, the cost of being coerced and not resisting. And 4. The cost of coercing. That is, the cost of failing to make a credible threat that leads the foe to acquiesce. It also allows all of the input variables to change, doing so in accordance with heuristic rules I impose on the game. That is, the model is designed so that player clout, salience, resolve, and position shift from iteration to iteration in response to the equilibrium conditions of the prior round of play. Because alternative heuristic rules chosen by others are likely to be as sensible and reliable as mine either for evaluating costs or for assessing how variable values change across periods of play, I do not dwell here on those aspects of the model. With these values in hand, here are the expected payoffs at terminal nodes in the first iteration. D and R denote, respectively, the belief that the subscripted player is a dove and a retaliator. These beliefs are updated in accordance with Bayes' rule. Off the equilibrium path beliefs are set at 0.5. Proposals go back and forth between players, but not all proposals are credible. They are credible if the outcome involves B giving in to A's coercion or if the absolute value of the proposal being made minus the target's current position relative to the range of available policy differences is less than the current resolve score of the target, with resolve defined in the next section. The predicted new position of each player in a given round is determined as the weighted mean of the credible proposals it receives and the predicted outcome as the weighted mean of all credible proposals in the round, smoothed as the average of the weighted means including the adjacent rounds just before and after the round in question. The nature of the proposal in each dyadic game is determined by the equilibrium outcome expected in that stage of the game. The weighted mean reflects the credibly proposed positions weighted by clout multiplied by salience. Phew, I hope the math mavens enjoyed that and the rest of you didn't mind it too much. Notes. Introduction. 1. See Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Leopold II and the Selectorate. An account in contrast to a racial explanation, Historical Social Research, Historische Sozialforschung, 32, No. 4. 2007, 203-21. 2. Vernon Mallinson, Some Sources for the History of Education in Belgium, British Journal of Educational Studies 4, No. 1. November 1955, 62-70. 3. See, for instance, Joseph Conrad, Youth, and Two Other Stories, New York. McClure, Phillips, 1903, Barbara Emerson. Leopold II of the Belgians, King of Colonialism, London. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, 1979. Peter Forbath. The River Congo, New York. Harper and Row, 1977. And Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost, Boston. Mariner Books, 1999. 4. The discussion that follows is based on the logic and evidence provided in Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Alistair Smith, Randolph M. Siverson, and James D. Morrow. The Logic of Political Survival, Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT Press, 2003. See especially Chapter 7. See also Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith, Political Survival and Endogenous Institutional Change, Comparative Political Studies 42, No. 2. February 2009, 167–97. 5. Petty dictators typically also have a pot of money that can be spent at their sole discretion. Democratic leaders have far less authority over spending. Discretionary funds can be used to benefit the citizenry or can be socked away in a secret bank account. One way to recognize civic-mindedness is to see how many benefits the public has compared to expectations, given the type of regime. Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew and China's Deng Xiaoping, for instance, seem to have been genuinely civic-minded. They implemented effective public policies while sustaining the loyalty of their essential supporters. Kim Jong-il, Robert Mugabe, and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, in contrast and to varying degrees, seem not so civic-minded. See Bueno de Mesquita, Smith, Siverson, and Morrow, Logic of Political Survival. 6. Stanley Feder, Factions and Policon. New Ways to Analyze Politics, in H. Bradford Westerfield, ed. Inside CIA's Private World. Declassified articles from the agency's internal journal, 1955–1992, New Haven. Yale University Press, 1995, and James L. Ray and Bruce M. Russett. The Future as Arbiter of Theoretical Controversies. Predictions, Explanations and the End of the Cold War, British Journal of Political Science 26, No. 4. October 1996, 441–70. Chapter 1. What will it take to put you in this car today? 1. See the jobs-rated almanac ratings at eguevara.com. 2. If you think body language is not important, do a search online for negotiation and body language. You will find article after article about how clothes sellers should place themselves to buyers, how they should use their hands and arms, facial expressions, etc. to improve the price they get and the odds of closing deals. Chapter 2. Game Theory 101. 1. John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, Princeton. Princeton University Press, 1947. 2. Sylvia Nasser, A Beautiful Mind. The Life of Mathematical Genius and Nobel Laureate John Nash, New York. Simon & Schuster, 1998. For progressively more thorough and technical introductions to game theory, starting with a completely readable non-technical treatment, see Avinash K. Dixit and Barry J. Nailbuff, Thinking Strategically. The Competitive Edge in Business, Politics and Everyday Life, New York. W. W. Norton, 1991, James D. Morrow. Game Theory for Political Scientists, Princeton. Princeton University Press, 1994, Martin J. Osborne. An Introduction to Game Theory, Oxford. Oxford University Press, 2003, and Drew Fudenberg and Jean Tirole, Game Theory, Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT Press, 1991. 3. $6 per day falls in the middle of the World Bank's estimate of per capita income for Iraq in 2007. Unlike for most countries, for Iraq the World Bank is not able to provide a firm number. Other estimates seem to be based on the World Bank's range. 4. Brian Kolodichuk, ed. Mother Teresa. Come Be My Light, The Private Writings of the Saint of Calcutta, New York, Doubleday, 2007. 5. See Irene Hao Su Chow, Victor P. Lau, Thamas Wing Chun Lo, Zhenquan Xia, and He Yun, Service Quality in Restaurant Operations in China. Decision and Experiential-Oriented Perspectives, International Journal of Hospitality Management 26, No. 3. September 2007, 698–710. 6. For the math mavens out there, the circle is a special case in which each dimension is of equal importance to the player. If one dimension is more important than the other, then we should draw an ellipse, each of whose radii reflects the relative importance of the issues. I skip this complicating detail here. 7. Those mathematically inclined and interested in delving more deeply into how it is possible for rational decision-makers to move from any policy combination to any other, see Richard McKelvey, Intransitivities in Multidimensional Voting Models and Some Implications for Agenda Control. Journal of Economic Theory 12, 1976, 472–82. Richard McKelvey, General Conditions for Global Intransitivities in Formal Voting Models, Econometrica 47, 1979, 1085–1112. And Norman Schofield, Instability of Simple Dynamic Games. Review of Economic Studies 45, 1978, 575–94. 8. For a careful study of steroid use that is broadly consistent with the values used in this example, see Jenny Jacobson Schultz, Jonas Lundmark, Mats Garlay, Ilona Skilving, Lena Ekstrom, and Anders Rein. Doping test results dependent on genotype of uridine diphosphoglucuronylyl transferase 2B17, the major enzyme for testosterone glucuronidation. Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism 93, No. 7. July 2008, 2500–2506. Based on the values in this study, about 9% of a random sample from the population would falsely test positive. I assume 10%. 9. Bayes' theorem allows us to answer the question, What is the probability a person is of a particular type, such as a performance-enhancing steroid user, given that they say or do something in particular, such as test positive for steroids? To answer this question we must solve the following calculation. Let P stand for probability, R for being a steroid user, S for testing positive, and R for being the type of baseball player who does not use steroids. The straight line symbol is read as given. Then P, R, S, equals. Read as the probability of being a steroid user given that you tested positive, P, R, S, equals the probability of testing positive given that you are a steroid user times the probability of being a steroid user divided by that same quantity plus the probability of testing positive given that you are not a steroid user times the probability that you are not a steroid user. Thus, the calculation is conditioned on the two sets of people who test positive, those who use steroids and those who don't. In the baseball example this translates into Chapter 3, Game Theory 102. 1. The first major efforts to show that arms races lead to war are the work of Lewis Fry Richardson, a distinguished meteorologist who predicted World War I but, using the same logic, failed to anticipate World War II. See his Arms and Insecurity, Chicago. Quadrangle, 1960. The literature tying arms races to war is vast but almost universally fails to consider that arms purchases are anticipatory, or, in game theory lingo, they are endogenous, strategic decisions. 2. The subject of renegotiation proofness has attracted the interest of many economists, leading to a vast literature. Some seminal papers include Dilip Abreu, David Pierce, and Ennio Stacchetti, Renegotiation and Symmetry in Repeated Games, Journal of Economic Theory 60, No. 2. 1993, 217-40. Jean-Pierre Benoit and Vijay Krishna, Renegotiation in Finitely Repeated Games, Econometrica 61, 1993, 303-23. And James Bergin and W. Bentley MacLeod, Efficiency and Renegotiation in Repeated Games, Journal of Economic Theory 61, No. 1. 1993, 42-73. 3. The seminal work on this question dates back to the 18th-century French philosopher, mathematician, and nobleman the Marquis de Condorcet. Regrettably, the latter characteristic, he opposed beheading the king and queen, cost him his life during the French Revolution. There is a wonderful statue of him on the left bank of the Seine, not too far from Notre Dame. I always pay homage to him when I am in Paris. His insights were built upon in the second half of the 20th century to establish the modern understanding of voting methods. See, for instance, Kenneth Arrow, Social Choice and Individual Values, New York. John Wiley & Sons, 1951. William H. Riker, Liberalism Against Populism, New York. Freeman, 1982. Richard D. McKelvey and Norman Schofield, Structural Instability of the Core, Journal of Mathematical Economics 15, No. 3. June 1986, 179-98. And Gary W. Cox, Making Votes Count, New York. Cambridge University Press, 1997. Chapter 4, Bombs Away. 1. Stanley Fetter, Factions and Policon. New Ways to Analyze Politics, in H. Bradford Westerfield, ed. Inside CIA's Private World. Declassified articles from the agency's internal journal, 1955-1992, New Haven. Yale University Press, 1995. 2. This is a casual statement of the median voter theorem, one of the most important concepts in understanding issue resolutions. See Duncan Black, The Theory of Committees and Elections, Cambridge. Cambridge University Press, 1958. And Anthony Downs, An Economic Theory of Democracy, New York. Harper, 1957. 3. This second first-cut prediction relies on the mean voter theorem. See Andrew Kaplan and Barry Nailbuff, Aggregation and Social Choice. A Mean Voter Theorem, Econometrica 59, 1991, 1-23. And Norman Schofield, The Mean Voter Theorem. Necessary and Sufficient Conditions for Convergent Equilibrium. Review of Economic Studies 74, 2007, 965-80. 4. See Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Ruminations on Challenges to Prediction with Rational Choice Models, Rationality and Society 15, No. 1. 2003, 136-47, and Robert Thompson, Franz N. Stockman, and Christopher H. Aitchen, eds. The European Union Decides, Cambridge. Cambridge University Press, 2006. Chapter 5. Napkins for Peace. 1. For a not-too-technical explanation of what goes on inside the model, see Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Predicting Politics, Columbus. Ohio State University Press, 2002. 2. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Multilateral Negotiations. A Spatial Analysis of the Arab-Israeli Dispute. International Organization, Summer 1990, 317-40. 3. C. Co.uk. 4. Anthony H. Cordesman, The Israel-Palestinian War. Escalating to Nowhere, Westport, Con. Prager, 2005, 219. Chapter 6. Engineering the Future. 1. For an early, foundational study applying war of attrition games, see John Maynard Smith and Jeffrey A. Parker, The Logic of Asymmetric Contests, Animal Behavior 24, 1976, 159-75. See also Anatole Rappaport, Two-Person Game Theory, Ann Arbor, University of Michigan Press, 1966. 2. C. For instance, James D. Fearon, Rationalist Explanations for War, International Organization 49, 1995, 379–414. Chapter 7. Fast Forward the Present. 1. For a deeper exploration of some surprising implications of commitment problems and the pursuit of peace with adversaries, in particular peace with terrorists, see Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, Conciliation, Counterterrorism, and Patterns of Terrorist Violence, International Organization 59, No. 1. 2005, 145–76. 2. The actual calculation predicting the impact of deaths, the horizontal axis, on tourism, the vertical axis, is based on the logarithm of deaths to capture order of magnitude changes. Doubling the lives lost from 10 deaths to 20, for instance, represents a more noticeable change than going from 190 to 200 deaths even though the absolute change is the same. Logarithms capture the magnitude of change so that equal spaces reflect equal percentage increments in lost lives. 3. Limitations on the availability of data constrain the number of years I can cover. Violence and tourism are both measured quarterly. The Palestinians suffer the lion's share of violent deaths. The graph looks very much the same if only Palestinian deaths are plotted rather than all violent deaths resulting from the conflict. Data on Israeli tourism are from the Bank of Israel and can be found at gov.il. Entries. Data on violent deaths are from David Fielding. How does violent conflict affect investment location decisions? Journal of Peace Research 41, No. 4. 2004, 465–84. 4. C. Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics press release for the Hotel Survey, 4th quarter 2005, found at pna.org. Chapter 8. How to Predict the Unpredictable. 1. See John Lewis Gaddis, International Relations Theory and the End of the Cold War, International Security 17, No. 3. Winter 1992, 323–73, and James Ray and Bruce Russett, The Future as Arbiter of Theoretical Controversies, Predictions, Explanations and the End of the Cold War, British Journal of Political Science 26, No. 4. October 1996, 441–70. 2. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Measuring Systemic Polarity, Journal of Conflict Resolution, June 1975, 187–215. And Michael F. Altfeld and Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Choosing Sides in Wars, International Studies Quarterly, March 1979, 87–112. 3. Eugene's data can be accessed at eugenesoftware.org. 4. See Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, The End of the Cold War, Predicting an Emergent Property, Journal of Conflict Resolution 42, No. 2. April 1998, 131–55. Chapter 9. Fun with the Past. 1. See Xenophon, Hellenica, Book 6, Chapter IV, downloaded from fordham.edu. 2. Edward Kritzler, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. How a Generation of Swashbuckling Jews Carved Out an Empire in the New World in Their Quest for Treasure, Religious Freedom, and Revenge, New York, Doubleday, 2008. 3. Niall Ferguson, The Pity of War. Explaining World War I, New York, Basic Books, 2000. Chapter 10. Dare to be Embarrassed. 1. See my TED Talk at ow.ly for my predictions about Iran's nuclear program. 2. The Algiers Accord, signed in 1975, was supposed to have resolved Iraq-Iran border disputes, such as over control of the Shatt al-Arab River near Basra where the river defines the boundary between Iran and Iraq. Despite the agreement, Saddam Hussein's Iraq attacked Iran 6 years later, beginning a war that lasted for 8 years. The border area remains a source of conflict while the Algiers Accord provides the legally, but not strategically, binding terms for delineating the boundaries of Iran and Iraq. As we know, promises are not the same as commitments, and nothing could be truer in the history of relations between Iran and Iraq. 3. A related analysis indicates that Tehran's mayor, Ghalibaf, is gaining in power. The next Iranian presidential election, though looking very close in my analyses, seems to give a small edge to Ahmadinejad. His power decline is more substantial after the election than before. 4. The patterns of political change shown here arise as well in analysis I did using completely different data on Iran. That gives me considerable confidence that they accurately reflect changing influence in Iran. For a portion of those other analyses see my TED Talk at ow.ly. Chapter 11. The Big Sweep. 1. The text of Lateran 2 can be found at www.fordham.edu/halsel/basis/lateran2.html. 2. Raoul van Kanegem, The Birth of the English Common Law, Cambridge. Cambridge University Press, 1988, 64. 3. Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie, Times of Feast, Times of Famine, New York, Doubleday, 1971. 4. George W. Downs, David M. Rock, and Peter Barsoom, Is the Good News About Compliance Good News for Cooperation? International Organization 50, 1996, 379–406. About the author. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita is Julius Silver Professor of Politics at New York University and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. A specialist in policy forecasting, political economy and international security policy, he received his doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan in 1971. Bueno de Mesquita is regularly identified as one of the most influential academics in the United States in the arena of foreign policy. He is the author of 15 books and more than 100 articles as well as numerous pieces in major newspapers and magazines. He has also appeared on The Today Show, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox News, Bloomberg TV, and Al Jazeera International, as well as television broadcasts in Brazil, China, Korea, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. His previous book, The Strategy of Campaigning, co-authored with Kiran K. Skinner, Serhii Koudelya, and Condoleezza Rice, was published in August 2007. Bueno de Mesquita has been and is an advisor to the American government on national security matters and to numerous corporations on questions related to mergers and acquisitions, litigation, regulation, labor management relations, and contract negotiations. He is a general partner in Mesquita and Roundell, LLC, a consulting firm focused on government and business applications of his game theory models. He lives in San Francisco and New York City. Copyright 2009 by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. All rights reserved. Published in the United States by Random House, an imprint of the Random House Publishing Group, a division of Random House, Inc., New York. Random House and Colophon are registered trademarks of Random House, Inc. Library of Congress cataloging and publication data. Bueno de Mesquita, Bruce. The Predictioneer's Game. Using the logic of brazen self-interest to see and shape the future, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. P. Cm. EISBN 978-1-58836-9086. 1. Game Theory. 2. Economic Man. 3. Self-Interest. I title. HB 144. B84 2009. 303.4901 feet 5193, DC 22. 2,009,005,686. Atrandom.com. Version 3.0_R1.